A man trained to survive war, a son too broken to speak, and one moment in a quiet cafe that would change everything. When Victor Lang walked into that cafe and destroyed a little boy's world in front of everyone, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Darius Kane had buried his rage for 2 years, right alongside the woman he loved. But when a bully's hand connected with his face, every instinct from a lifetime of combat came screaming back to the surface. What happened next silenced an entire room. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. And if it hits your heart, hit that like button before we go any further. But Part 1. The Castles We Build. The sugar packets were stacked 4 layers high before Nolan even reached for a 5th. Darius watched from across the small cafe table, his coffee going cold beside his elbow, his eyes doing what they always did on Tuesday afternoons, tracking his son with the quiet, careful attention of a man who had spent years watching for danger in every direction. Only now the danger was invisible, the kind you couldn't neutralize with training or equipment or tactical advantage, the kind that lived inside a 6-year-old boy who hadn't said a single word in 22 months. Nolan's fingers were precise, deliberate. He had his mother's hands, long, careful fingers that moved with a patience that had no business existing in a child his age. Each sugar packet was placed with the seriousness of an architect laying a cornerstone, and whenever one slid sideways or threatened to collapse the structure, Nolan would pause, study the problem with those enormous dark eyes, and quietly correct it. No frustration, no noise, just adjustment, and then continuation. The cafe was called Ember and Ground, a neighborhood spot on the corner of Birch and Holloway that smelled like dark roast and cardamom and something faintly floral that Darius had never been able to identify. It was the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on exposed brick walls, where regulars sat with laptops and paperbacks, and where the Tuesday afternoon crowd was usually thin enough that a man and his silent son could occupy a corner table without drawing too much attention. That mattered to Darius. The not drawing attention part. He lifted his coffee, took a sip even though it had gone lukewarm, and said in a low and unhurried voice, "That's a good foundation. You're leaving space between the packets this time." Nolan didn't look up, but the slight shift in his shoulders, a kind of settling, a relaxation across the line of his back, told Darius that he had heard, that he was listening. That was something the therapist, Dr. Ayanna Mills, had told him early on. He hears everything you say, Mr. Kane. He processes it. The silence is not the same as absence. Darius had held on to that sentence like a lifeline. He set the coffee down and leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes move briefly around the room the way they always did. Not anxiously, just habitually. A pattern worn so deep into him that he no longer even registered it as checking. The habit of a man who had spent years in places where not paying attention could get people killed. There was the barista, a young woman named Priya with a septum ring and paint-stained fingers who always gave Nolan a free cookie without asking. There was an older couple sharing a scone near the window, a college-age kid with headphones and a textbook. A woman in scrubs reading something on her phone. Nothing unusual, nothing that required anything from him. He exhaled slowly and turned back to his son. Nolan had reached the 5th layer now. The sugar castle was narrow at the top and wide at the base, stabilized with what looked like a cross brace of individual packets laid horizontal. It was objectively an impressive feat of structural engineering for a child who had just turned 6 3 weeks ago. "You've been thinking about how to keep it from tipping," Darius said. Not a question, an observation. Again, that small settling of the shoulders. Darius thought about how he had learned to read his son in silences the way other fathers read report cards or listened to school day recaps over dinner. He knew the difference between the silence that meant, "I'm tired," and the silence that meant, "I'm thinking," and the silence that meant, "Something hurt me today, and I don't know how to move it out of my body yet." He had become fluent in a language that had no words. It had cost him enormously to learn it. Not because it was hard, but because every lesson in that language was also a reminder of why Nolan had gone quiet in the first place. Serena. He didn't think her name so much as feel it. A pressure behind his sternum, always present, some days sharp and some days dull, but never entirely absent. 22 months and 6 days since the accident. Since the call that had come in at 4 in the morning while Darius was on a job site in the warehouse district. installing crown molding in a renovation that suddenly meant nothing at all, since the world had reorganized itself around a wound that wouldn't close. Serena Kane, 31 years old, a high school art teacher who laughed too loud at her own jokes and cried at nature documentaries and made the best jerk chicken Darius had ever tasted, including his own mother's, though he would have taken that admission to his grave. She had been driving home from a late parent-teacher conference. The other driver had run a red light. Nolan had not spoken since the night Darius sat down on the edge of his bed and told him that his mother wasn't coming home. Some grief turns children loud, tantrums and rages, and the kind of crying that seems like it will break through walls. Nolan's grief had gone the other direction entirely. It had gone inward, deep and still, like a lake in winter. His teacher said he was cooperative, attentive, sweet with the other children, just silent, always silent, like something inside him had decided that words required more trust than the world had recently proven it deserved. Doctor. Mills called it selective mutism brought on by acute trauma. She said there was no timeline. She said pressure would only extend the silence, that the most important thing was safety. Consistent, patient, unconditional safety. She said, he will find his way back when his nervous system believes the world is stable again. So Darius had made himself a fortress of stability. He had stopped taking the long-haul jobs that kept him away for weeks. He had rearranged his carpentry work to school hours and afternoons, building furniture and doing renovations for a rotating list of clients who had come to respect the quiet craftsmen who showed up on time and built things that lasted. He had enrolled Nolan in the small school 4 blocks from their apartment, walked him there every morning and picked him up every afternoon, learned the names of every child in the class and every teacher in the building. He had established routines with the rigorous devotion of a man who understood that structure was a form of love. Tuesday afternoons at Ember and Ground were part of that structure. They had started 6 months ago, when Darius had noticed Nolan pausing outside the cafe window every time they passed, drawn, apparently, by the stacks of sugar packets left on each table. On impulse, Darius had pushed open the door and taken them inside. Priya had given Nolan a cookie. Nolan had built his first sugar castle. They had been coming every week since. It wasn't much. In the grand ledger of everything a father could do for a grieving child, a weekly trip to a cafe barely registered. But Darius had learned, in the quiet months since Serena's death, that consistency was everything, that small rituals were actually enormous, that the same table, the same corner, the same Tuesday afternoon, the same sugar packets and the same cookie, all of it was telling Nolan something that couldn't be said in words. I will always bring you here. This will always be the same. You are safe. He was not a man who talked easily about feelings. He had grown up in a house where emotions were things you managed, not displayed, where his father, a veteran himself, though from a different war, had expressed love through action and provision and presence, rather than language. Darius had inherited that tendency. It had served him well in the military and caused him considerable pain everywhere else. With Serena, it had been different. She had been the kind of person who asked you what you were thinking and actually waited for the answer, who could sit in a silence with you without making it awkward, who had this gift for creating space in a conversation where the hard things could land without judgment. She had taught him, slowly and with enormous patience, how to say the things that lived in the parts of him he'd kept locked up since childhood. He had been getting better at it, and then she was gone, and the only person left to practice with was a child who couldn't respond. So he practiced anyway. He talked to Nolan through the silence, told him about jobs, about the grain of different kinds of wood, about what the weather was supposed to do tomorrow, about the cardinal that kept showing up on the fire escape outside Nolan's bedroom window. Small things, constant things. Proof that the world was still there and still worth describing. You want another sugar packet? Darius asked. You're getting close to the top. Nolan reached across the table toward the small ceramic dish of extra packets, and then stopped. His hand hovered mid-air. His body went very still. Darius felt it before he heard it. The door of the cafe opened with a force that made the small bell above it clatter awkwardly instead of ring. The sound had an edge to it, abrupt, assertive, the entrance of someone who treated doors as things to be conquered rather than opened. The man who walked in was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders with the particular softness of a man who had once been athletic but had since replaced discipline with prosperity. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, a shirt the color of cream, no tie. The collar open in the way wealthy men wear their informality as its own kind of display. His hair was silver gray, slicked back. His jaw was set in the expression of a man who had not waited in a line in years and did not intend to start. Behind him, a younger man, an assistant of some kind, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the practiced blankness of someone paid to be invisible, pulled out his phone immediately and began typing without being asked. The man in the charcoal suit swept his gaze around the cafe with the efficiency of someone conducting an inspection. His eyes paused briefly on Darius and Nolan's corner table, passed on, settled on the counter where Priya was making change for the couple near the window. "Hey." His voice carried easily across the small space, not shouting, just the voice of someone who had never had to raise it to be heard. "I need a table for two, that corner one." He pointed, directly at the corner where Darius and Nolan were already sitting. Priya looked up from the register. "That table's taken, sir, but there are several open ones." "I can see that." He didn't look at Priya when he said it. "I want that one. Corner tables are quieter. I'm expecting a call." I understand, but is there a manager?" A brief practiced pause from Priya. "I'm the shift manager today." "Then solve the problem." Priya's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened fractionally. She was good at her job and she was practiced at difficult customers. "Sir, that table is occupied. I'm happy to seat you at the table by the window, which is also a corner. I don't want the one by the window." He said it the way you might correct a slow student. "I want the corner at the back. It's quieter." He was already moving toward Darius and Nolan's table. Darius watched him come without moving. He set his coffee down. He put both hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture of stillness, and he watched the man cross the cafe floor with the entitlement of someone who had genuinely never considered the possibility that the world might tell him no. The man stopped at the edge of their table and looked down at them. First at Darius, then at Nolan, then at the sugar castle, with a brief flicker of disdain that he didn't bother to conceal. "You about done here?" Darius met his eyes. "We're not." A short silence. The kind that has weight to it. "I need this table." "There are other tables open," Darius said. His voice was level. Deliberately level. The voice he used when he needed to communicate firmness without escalation. A voice he had calibrated over years of operating in high-tension environments, where tone could mean the difference between resolution and disaster. "I wasn't talking to you," the man said. The room had gone quiet. The college-age kid had pulled off his headphones. The woman in scrubs had lowered her phone. Priya had come around the counter and was moving toward them. Nolan's hand was still hovering over the table, inches from the ceramic dish of sugar packets, frozen there as if he had pressed pause on himself. His eyes were fixed on the tabletop. Darius felt the particular stillness that used to come over him before a dangerous situation resolved itself one way or another. The stillness of a man whose instincts have gone very quiet and very sharp at the same time. "My name is Victor Lang," the man said, as if that explained everything, as if names at that tax bracket were self-explanatory. "I have a conference call in 11 minutes that I can't take in my car because the reception in this neighborhood is terrible. I need a corner table with a wall at my back. This is the only one that works." He looked at Darius with an expression of profound impatience. "So what's it going to take?" "Nothing," Darius said, "because we're not leaving." Victor Lang stared at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating, encountering, perhaps for the first time in recent memory, someone who was not going to fold. Then he looked down at the sugar castle, and something shifted in his expression. Not to cruelty exactly, but to the particular contempt of a man who had decided, in that moment, that the most efficient path to getting what he wanted was to dismantle the thing in front of him. "What is this?" he said, not to Darius. Almost to himself, the way you'd remark on an inconvenience. "Don't," Darius said quietly. Victor's eyes cut to him, then back to the castle. And then, with the casual deliberateness of a man who had never once in his life considered consequences, Victor Lang reached out and swept his hand across the table. The sugar castle exploded. Packets scattered across the table and the floor, skittering in every direction, the careful architecture of the last 45 minutes demolished in a single, careless motion. One packet spun off the edge of the table and landed at Nolan's feet. The room went absolutely silent. Nolan did not move, did not make a sound. But Darius watched his son's face in the half-second after it happened. Watched the way Nolan's expression didn't crumple or contort the way a child's might in an ordinary tantrum-triggering moment. Instead, it did something far worse. It went blank. Carefully, deliberately blank, the way it had looked in the weeks after Serena died. When Nolan had been wrapping himself inside himself like a creature retreating from a winter that had come too soon. The blankness of a child who had already learned that the world could take things from you without warning. Darius felt something move through him, something deep and old and very, very precise. He had felt it before, in places he no longer allowed himself to visit in daylight. It was not rage. Rage was hot and chaotic and easily readable. This was something colder, more geometric. The part of him that had been trained to assess threats with complete efficiency and respond without hesitation. He did not move. He pressed his hands harder against the table. Because Nolan was watching, not looking up. Nolan never looked up when things got loud or large or threatening, but watching in the way that children who have learned to be afraid watch, with every peripheral sense at maximum sensitivity, calibrated to detect exactly what the adults around them were going to do next. Darius breathed in, then out. "You need to step back from this table," he said. His voice was very quiet. Not menacing, though the quiet itself had a particular quality to it that made the college kid with the headphones go still. Just factual. The way you'd state a load-bearing measurement. Victor Lang blinked, looked at the scattered sugar packets with something that was perhaps the first faint shade of second thought. Then he looked at Darius, really looked at him, in the way people sometimes did when they finally allowed the data in front of them to override their assumptions. Taking in the size of him, the absolute stillness, the quality of the silence Darius was inhabiting. "I'll get you a new table and new tea," Priya began from behind him, but Victor raised a hand without turning around. "I'll tell you something," Victor said to Darius, in the measured tone of a man who had decided to redirect rather than retreat. "The problem with people like you is that you make everything about dignity. Nobody's attacking your dignity. I knocked over some sugar packets. It's not a federal case." "People like me," Darius repeated. The phrase landed in the room, and nobody breathed. "Working people," Victor said, his expression shifting into something that might have been backpedaling if it had been faster. "People who make a grievance out of every inconvenience. I have a conference call that determines whether 47 employees keep their jobs or get cut in a restructure. What are your stakes here, exactly?" It was, Darius recognized, a skilled pivot, the kind of argument designed to make the other person look petty for being upset. He had encountered that rhetorical move before, in contexts that would have turned this man's blood cold. "My stakes," Darius said, "are that my son built that for 45 minutes, and you destroyed it in 3 seconds for no reason other than that you wanted to." Nolan's hands were flat on his thighs now, still. His eyes were still down. Victor glanced at Nolan, and in that glance, Darius read something that made the cold precision inside him sharpen further. Dismissal. Not cruelty exactly. Something worse. The complete absence of recognition that Nolan was a full person worth considering. "Kids rebuild things," Victor said. "That's what they do. He'll be fine." "He doesn't speak," Darius said. He didn't mean it as an explanation. He meant it as a fact he was laying down between them, a line being drawn. "He hasn't spoken since his mother died. That castle is one of the few things he makes that he's proud of, and you walked over here and destroyed it because you wanted a table." The woman in scrubs had put her phone completely away. The older couple by the window had turned fully around. Priya was standing 3 feet away with her arms crossed, watching Victor with the expression of someone who had made a decision about how this was going to go. Victor's jaw tightened, the first real crack in his composure. "I didn't know. You didn't ask," Darius said. "You didn't look. You came in here like nothing in this room mattered except what you needed, and you're still doing it right now." "I'll leave a tip," Victor said, "for the inconvenience." He was already reaching into his jacket, the gesture automatic, the solution of a man who had learned to purchase his way out of complications. "Put your wallet away," Darius said. A silence. Victor looked at him, and then, in the decision of a man whose pride had backed itself into a corner it couldn't tolerate, Something shifted behind his eyes, something that chose the worst available path. "Who do you think you are?" Victor said. Low, deliberate. "Sitting there in this cafe like you have anywhere else to be, lecturing me about Victor." The assistant had finally spoken, his voice careful and controlled in the way of someone who had witnessed this particular escalation before and knew what came next. Victor didn't look at him. His eyes were on Darius, and what was in them now was not contempt exactly, but something uglier. The particular rage of a man whose certainty about his own importance was being systematically dismantled by someone who clearly didn't know he was supposed to be afraid. "You should be careful," Victor said, and the sentence had a shape to it that was meant to carry threat. Darius looked at him steadily. "So should you." The silence between them was absolute. And then Victor Lang made the last and most catastrophic mistake of his afternoon. He raised his hand, not all the way back, not a full swing, but the flat, sharp slap of someone who had learned that violence, applied selectively and with confidence, had always functioned as a reliable way to reestablish hierarchy. His palm connected with Darius's face. The sound of it was appalling in the quiet cafe, sharp, unambiguous. The woman in scrubs stood up from her chair. Priya said, "Oh," and stopped. The college kid backed his chair away from his table. Nolan's head came up. For the first time during the entire confrontation, those enormous dark eyes lifted, not toward Victor, but toward his father. Watching, reading, processing with the totality of a child who had learned that the adult world's responses were the map by which you navigated the safety of any given moment. And Darius Kane sat very, very still. His cheek burned. His hands were flat on the table. Inside the cavity of his chest, something enormous and ancient had woken up and was currently assessing the situation with a speed and efficiency that no amount of civilian life had managed to fully extinguish. He could feel his own heartbeat with extraordinary clarity. He could feel the distance between himself and Victor. He could feel the weight distribution of the man in front of him, the position of his feet, the angle of his shoulders. He knew exactly what he could do. He knew exactly how fast. He could see it, not in a violent fantasy sort of way, but with the clinical precision of a man whose body had been educated in that particular geometry for years. Victor Lang would not have seen it coming. It would have been over before anyone in the cafe had time to process what had happened. Victor would have been on the floor. Darius breathed. He looked at his son. Nolan was watching him with those wide, still eyes. Not scared, or not only scared, watching in the way that children watch when they are trying to learn the most important thing the world has ever tried to teach them. Darius breathed again. He pressed his hands harder against the table until he could feel the grain of the wood beneath his palms, the particular texture of reclaimed oak, slightly rough on one edge where the finish had worn. He cataloged it consciously, deliberately. The pressure, the grain, the temperature of the surface, the smell of coffee and cardamom and something faintly floral. The moment stretched. Time moved the way it sometimes did in high-stress situations. Not slowly, exactly, but with a density that made each second fully occupy its allotted space rather than sliding past unexamined. And then a voice spoke from across the cafe. "Son." It was a single word, spoken quietly, without urgency, in the particular register of a voice that had spent decades commanding in environments where shouting was counterproductive and tone was everything. The man was somewhere in his early 60s, compact and straight-backed, in the way of someone for whom posture had never been optional. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple button-down, a watch that was expensive but not flashy, and he had apparently been sitting at a table near the back wall that Darius had noted as occupied but not examined closely. He was on his feet now, moving without hurry toward the center of the room. He was looking at Darius. Not at Victor, at Darius. And the look on his face was one that Darius had seen before, had sat across from before, in briefing rooms and debrief rooms and in the particular kind of after-action conversation that happened when everything had gone wrong and the work of making sense of it was just beginning. The look of a man who was fully present and fully in command of the situation and waiting, with complete patience, for someone else to make the decision that mattered. Darius held his gaze, and something in Darius's chest, that enormous ancient thing that had woken up, didn't exactly stand down. but it held. Victor was still standing at the table. His hand, which had delivered the slap, was now at his side. And for the first time in the last several minutes, he looked like someone who might be in the early stages of recognizing that he had made an error whose magnitude he had not yet fully calculated. The older man reached the center of the room. He stopped equidistant between Darius and Victor and looked, for the first time, at Victor Lang. "My name is Ezra Boone," he said. "Colonel, United States Army, retired, and you have just put your hand on the face of one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced." The cafe was motionless. Victor blinked. "I don't see what—" "You will," Colonel Boone said, and his voice, when he said it, carried the complete and unambiguous authority of a man who had long ago stopped needing volume to be heard. The sugar packets lay scattered across the floor of ember and ground, each one a small white rectangle on dark hardwood, pieces of a castle that had taken 45 minutes to build and 3 seconds to destroy. Nolan Kane looked at his father, and for the first time in 2 years, he was waiting. Not with the passive waiting of a child who had given up on outcomes, but with the taut, leaning attention of someone who believed, against all accumulated evidence, that something was about to be worth it. Part 2. Lưu ý oai. Việc sao nghiên đến sao nghiên nằm trong to liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc, kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện, điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật, không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Showmore 1054, Colonel Ezra Boone had a way of filling a room without raising his voice. It wasn't physical. Though he was built solidly enough, the kind of compact, deliberate frame that suggested a man who had never once in his life been careless about what he put into his body or asked of it. It was something else, something in the quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space without apologizing for it or performing it. Some men announced themselves with volume. Boone announced himself with density, the specific gravity of someone who had, over the course of a long and demanding life, learned to make every single one of his words count. He stood equidistant between Darius and Victor Lang, and he did not look at Victor the way most people in the room were looking at Victor, with the embarrassed, averted gaze of bystanders who had witnessed something they wished they could unsee. He looked at Victor the way a man looks at a structural problem he is in the process of solving. "Do you know what a Green Beret is?" Boone asked. Victor's jaw moved. He was recalibrating visibly, his whole body language cycling through a series of postures, dismissal, belligerence, uncertainty, before landing, uncertainly, on something closer to caution. "Special Forces," he said. "Military." "That's close enough for now," Boone said. The man you just struck spent 11 years operating in environments where the average life expectancy of a wrong decision was measured in seconds. He has been in 4 countries whose names I'm not going to say in a coffee shop. He has carried wounded men out of situations that the people planning those situations had already written off as unrecoverable. He paused. He has done things on behalf of this country that you will never know about, because the kind of work that keeps people like you safe is specifically designed to be invisible to people like you. The cafe was perfectly still. Victor's assistant had taken a single step backward. His portfolio was at his side, forgotten. "He chose," Boone continued, his voice unchanging, "not to respond to what you just did. I want you to think about what that means. Not because he couldn't, because he decided not to. That decision, that specific decision, right there in the last 60 seconds, required more discipline than anything you have done in your entire professional life." Victor's face had gone through several colors. It had settled now on something pale and tight, the face of a man who had spent his whole life understanding the world as a ledger where his name appeared reliably in the credit column and was encountering, for the first time in recent memory, a set of numbers that refused to cooperate. "I don't know who you are," Victor said. His voice had lost its carrying quality. It was smaller now, but still attempting purchase on some remaining high ground. "And I don't need a lecture from a Victor." Boone said his name the way you'd plant a flag. Not loud. Absolute. "I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Something in Victor's body responded to that tone before his brain could intercede. His chin came up, but his shoulders dropped a quarter inch. The involuntary response of a body recognizing, on some cellular level, the voice of someone who meant exactly what they said. "This man," Boone said, with a slight inclination of his head toward Darius, "lost his wife 19 months ago. He is raising his son alone. He works 6 days a week, and he brings his boy here every Tuesday because it is one of the things that helps." He said the last word cleanly, without sentiment, which somehow made it heavier. "He's not going to tell you any of that himself, because men built the way he's built don't explain their wounds to people who've demonstrated they aren't worth explaining to. So I'm telling you." The woman in scrubs was standing now, had been standing since the slap, her chair pushed back, her expression one of controlled fury. The older couple by the window had not moved, but were watching with the specific attention of people who had lived long enough to recognize a moment. Priya was behind the counter. She had her phone in her hand. Nolan had not moved. He was still at the table, both hands flat on his thighs, eyes up now, watching his father with an expression that Darius, in another moment, would have been able to read precisely. But Darius was not looking at Nolan right now. He was looking at Boone, and his expression was doing something complicated, something between relief and the particular pride of a man who hadn't realized until this moment how much he had needed someone to stand beside him. "He chose not to respond to you," Boone said to Victor, "because his son was watching, because the most important thing in that man's life was sitting across from him, and he made a calculation, in the middle of what I can assure you was an extremely significant provocation, about what that child needed to see. That is not weakness." He let that land. "That is the single most difficult thing a man trained for combat can do. And he did it in about 3 seconds, while you were standing there congratulating yourself on your conference call." Victor Lang said nothing. The silence in Ember and Ground was the kind that changes rooms. Not just quiets them, changes them. The way a room feels different after lightning is struck close by, the air carrying the electrical memory of something that came very near. Darius had not moved during Boone's entire address. His hands were still on the table, still pressing against the worn oak. His cheek had stopped burning, or rather, the burn had been absorbed into the larger stillness he was maintaining. He was looking at Boone and thinking, with the layered and involuntary gratitude of a man who does not ask for help and therefore feels its arrival with disproportionate force, that some debts couldn't be measured. He and Boone had not seen each other in 3 years. The last time had been at a ceremony that Darius had attended in civilian clothes, sitting in the back, there to honor a man from their unit who had not come home from a 3rd deployment. They had spoken briefly afterward in the parking lot, the kind of conversation that carried 10 years of history inside 20 minutes of words, and then gone their separate ways in the manner of men who understood that the work of return was something each person had to do alone. Boone had not changed significantly. A little more gray, a few more lines. But the fundamental quality of him, that particular density, that absolute absence of performance, was exactly as Darius remembered. "I owe you an apology," Victor said. Everyone looked at him. He said it again, and this time it came out less practiced, less boardroom, more like something he had actually arrived at. "I owe you an apology." He was looking at Darius, his hands were at his sides. He had made some internal decision, apparently, to stop positioning. "What I did to the—" He paused, glancing at the scattered sugar packets on the floor. "What I did was wrong, and what I did after was worse." He exhaled through his nose. "I don't have an excuse for it." Darius studied him for a moment. "I'm not looking for your apology," Darius said. His voice was still level, still quiet, still carrying that quality of precision that made everything he said feel weighed before it was spoken. "I'm looking at my son." Victor's gaze moved to Nolan, and this time he looked actually looked, in the way he hadn't before and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not the Hollywood version of remorse, but something real, if small. The look of a man seen, possibly for the first time in the last 15 minutes, a child sitting at a table instead of an obstacle attached to a table. Nolan was looking back at him. That was the thing that hit the room. Everyone felt it. This child, this small and silent child who had not looked directly at Victor during any of the preceding confrontation, was now looking at him with the full, level, undeflected gaze of someone who had decided to see exactly what was in front of him. There was no anger in it, no accusation, just looking. The way a very young child looks at something new, not yet decided whether it is safe or not, gathering data. Victor held that gaze for 3 seconds, which in that particular silence felt considerably longer. Then he looked away first. He reached into his jacket, the same gesture as before, when he'd reached for his wallet. And Darius's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slightest tightening. But what Victor pulled out was not his wallet. It was a business card, which he set on the edge of the table, not pushing it toward Darius, just leaving it there. "For whatever it's worth," Victor said. "If there's anything—" He stopped, seemed to recognize that the sentence couldn't end anywhere that wouldn't sound like an attempt to purchase resolution. He left it unfinished, picked up nothing, said nothing further. He turned to his assistant, who was already moving toward the door. He walked through it without the force he'd used on the way in. The bell above the door made its normal sound this time. The door swung shut. For a moment, nobody in Ember and Ground moved or spoke. Then the woman in scrubs sat back down in her chair with the long exhale of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for several minutes. The college kid put his headphones back on slowly, as if uncertain whether the silence was truly over. The older couple near the window exchanged a look that contained entire paragraphs. Priya set her phone down on the counter. "Can I get anyone anything?" she said, into the recovering quiet. "On the house." It was exactly the right thing to say. Several people laughed, not because it was particularly funny, but because the laugh was an available valve and the room needed one. The tension broke unevenly, like ice fracturing, and the ordinary sounds of a cafe began to re-establish themselves. The hiss of the espresso machine, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of a newspaper. Boone crossed the rest of the way to Darius's table and stood there a moment, looking down at the scattered sugar packets. Then he pulled out the chair across from Darius, the empty one, the one that had been empty since Serena, and sat down. "You okay?" he said. "Fine," Darius said. "Your cheek." "It's fine." Boone looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had spent decades evaluating the accuracy of the word fine as applied to people under stress. Then he looked at Nolan. "This your boy?" he said, and his voice, when he said it, was different. Stripped of the authority register, lower and warmer, the voice of a man who had grandchildren and knew how to talk to small people. Darius looked at Nolan. "Nolan, this is Colonel Boone. He's someone I used to work with, a long time ago." Nolan looked at Boone. The data-gathering look. Measuring. Boone met it without flinching and without performing. He just looked back quietly, giving Nolan space to complete the assessment. After a moment, he said, "I heard you're a builder." He said it the way you'd say it to another adult. No elevation, no baby talk softness, just a direct sentence addressed to a small person who deserved direct sentences. Nolan looked at the scattered sugar packets on the table and floor. "Rough afternoon for the castle," Boone said. "I've had rough days for things I built, too." He picked up one of the sugar packets from the floor beside his chair and set it on the table in front of Nolan. "You think it can be rebuilt?" Darius watched his son. Nolan looked at the single sugar packet. Then his eyes moved across the table, taking inventory of the remaining packets. Some had fallen to the floor, but several were still on the tabletop, displaced but intact. His hands came off his thighs, slowly, with the careful deliberation that characterized everything he did. He picked up a sugar packet, placed it on the table, picked up another. Darius felt something shift in his chest, that particular quality of movement that had become so familiar in the last 2 years, the feeling of a door that was very heavy moving a fraction of an inch. He kept his face still. He had learned not to react visibly to Nolan's small acts of re-engagement, because visible reaction created pressure, and pressure created retreat. You celebrated internally and then you kept breathing, because the last thing Nolan needed was to feel like his every gesture was being monitored and graded. Boone watched Nolan place a second packet beside the first. He said nothing. He sat with the ease of someone who had all the time in the world, which Darius recognized as a skill. The ability to make time feel spacious was something you had to practice. "You were good today," Boone said quietly to Darius, while Nolan sorted packets. Darius didn't answer immediately. "I almost wasn't. Almost doesn't count. It felt close." "It always feels close," Boone said. "That's what makes the choice real. If it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be a choice." He was quiet for a moment, watching Nolan. He saw it, every second of it. "I know. That matters more than you think." Darius looked at his son, at the careful hands, the deliberate economy of each motion, the way Nolan was already organizing the recovered packets into what looked like the beginning of a new foundation. "I know," he said again, and this time it meant something different. Priya appeared at the table with a fresh coffee for Darius, a small hot chocolate, unsolicited, which meant she'd made the call herself, and a plate with 2 cookies. "Thank you," Darius said. "Don't thank me," Priya said, with the crisp dignity of someone who had decided she wasn't going to make a production of the fact that she'd just witnessed something significant. She set everything down neatly and went back to the counter. Boone wrapped both hands around the coffee Priya had also apparently brought for him. The man was on a first-name basis here, which meant he had been coming to Ember and Ground longer than the last 15 minutes, and leaned back slightly in the chair. "I didn't plan to be here today," he said. "I come in sometimes when I'm in the neighborhood. My daughter lives 3 blocks over." "I didn't know you had a daughter in the city." "She moved here 2 years ago. Takes the kids to that little park on Holloway." He glanced at Darius. "I've seen you a few Tuesdays, actually. Wasn't sure if you'd want company." Darius looked at him. "You've been coming here the same time as us." "Sometimes." "And you never said anything." Boone looked at his coffee. "You seemed like a man who needed the space." A pause. "Until you didn't." That was, Darius thought, one of the most accurate things anyone had said to him in 2 years. He had needed the space. He had needed to exist inside the new shape of his life without having to explain it, without the weight of other people's sympathy, without the particular exhaustion of being someone's story. He had needed to just be a man in a cafe with his boy, building something out of whatever was available. And Boone had read that with the precision of someone who had known him for a long time, and had given him exactly the space he needed for exactly as long as he needed it, and had then, when the moment shifted, walked across a cafe without hesitation and done the thing Darius couldn't do for himself. "Thank you," Darius said. He said it simply, without qualification. Boone nodded once. It was enough. On the table between them, Nolan was building. The new structure was different from the first one, less tall, for now. He was still collecting scattered packets from the table surface, which limited the available materials. But the base was wider, and the organization was different. He'd shifted to a crosshatch pattern at the foundation level, alternating the direction of successive packets, which was architecturally distinct from his earlier approach. Darius noticed this with the specific attention he gave everything Nolan did. The crosshatch was stronger than vertical stacking. It distributed weight more evenly. Either Nolan had been thinking about the failure mode of the earlier structure and was problem-solving, or the new design had emerged from some other interior logic. Either way, it was different. Something had changed in the approach. A small sound at the table beside them drew his attention briefly. It was a family that had come in sometime during the confrontation. A woman in her 30s and a little girl who looked around Nolan's age, maybe slightly older, 7 or 8. The little girl had curly hair and a jacket covered in embroidered flowers, and she was sitting across from her mother with a hot chocolate and a picture book, but she was not reading the picture book. She was watching Nolan build. The mother glanced up from her phone, caught Darius's eye, and gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "I saw what happened. I'm sorry. Your kid is great." He returned it briefly. The little girl said, to no one in particular, and in the carrying way of children who have not yet learned to modulate public volume, "That's really good." Nolan's hands paused. Darius kept very still. Nolan did not look at the girl, but the pause was different from a startled pause or a frightened pause. It was more like the pause of someone who has just received a piece of information they weren't expecting and need a moment to file it correctly. He makes them every Tuesday, Darius said to the little girl, keeping his voice easy and unweighted. Not addressing Nolan, not creating pressure, just making a factual contribution to the conversation the girl had started. Does he make different ones every time? The girl asked. He does, Darius said. The girl considered this. What happened to the last one? Darius glanced at the scattered packets still on the floor near the table. It got knocked over. That's sad, the girl said, with complete sincerity and zero editorializing, the clean honesty of a child who had not yet learned to soften truth into social acceptability. I'd be really sad if someone knocked over something I made. Nolan's hands had not resumed building. They rested at the edges of the new foundation. What's his name? The girl asked. Darius opened his mouth. Nolan, said Boone easily before Darius could answer, and then looked at Darius with the slight lift of an eyebrow that said, forgive the presumption, and Darius shook his head fractionally to say, it's fine. I'm Ivy, the girl said to the space roughly in Nolan's direction, not specifically making eye contact with him, just offering the information the way you might set something down on a table. Available, if he wanted it. Nolan did not respond, but his hands returned to the sugar packets. He placed one, then another. The crosshatch continued. Ivy watched him for a moment. Then she went back to her picture book, or at least she looked at her picture book, though her eyes kept drifting back to the table across from her. Her mother had gone back to her phone, apparently content to let the afternoon proceed at whatever pace it chose. Boone leaned slightly forward, wrapping his hands around his cup. You ever think about reaching back out? He said to Darius. Not quietly exactly, but in the tone of a conversation that was separate from the room, the way two people who know each other well can talk in a crowd and still be private. To the unit? To anyone. Tom Vasquez is in Cincinnati now. Private security, doing fine. Keeler got married again. Believe it or not. A very small smile. There are people who'd want to know how you are. Darius was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. He stopped. Started again. It was hard for a while to be around people who knew me before. It felt like they were looking at me and seeing the before version, and I couldn't. He moved one hand slightly on the table. Not a gesture exactly, more like something he'd started to complete and then reconsidered. I couldn't explain the distance between the person I used to be and whatever I was becoming. Boone listened to this without interjection, which was one of the things Darius had always respected about him. He was a man who could receive information without immediately filling the space it opened. And now? Boone said. Darius looked at Nolan, at the crosshatch foundation, which had grown to cover most of the available space on the table, at his son's careful hands, moving with the deliberate precision that seemed to mean something new today, something slightly more intentional, as if the destruction of the first castle had not defeated the project but revised it. Now I'm starting to think, Darius said, that maybe the distance isn't as permanent as I thought. Boone nodded. They sat with that for a moment. Can I ask you something? Darius said. Yes. When you stood up, when he hit me, were you already planning to say something, or did you just... I stood up the second his hand went back, Boone said. I'd been watching from the back for about 5 minutes. I was trying to decide whether you needed me to do anything, and then I decided you probably didn't, and then... He paused. And then his hand went back, and I was on my feet before I made any decision about it. You didn't know if I was going to... I knew exactly what you were going to do, Boone said. You were going to sit there. That was the only thing in the room I was completely certain of. He met Darius's eyes. What I didn't know was what it was costing you. Darius held that. It was, he thought, the most accurate sentence anyone had said to him in 2 years, and he felt it land somewhere deeper than he had space to examine right now. It was costing, he said. The admission was small and simple and the hardest thing he had said out loud in months. I know, Boone said. From the table beside them, Ivy had abandoned all pretense of reading her picture book. She was watching Nolan openly now, with the unself-conscious attention of a child who finds something genuinely interesting and sees no reason to hide the fact. Her hot chocolate sat cooling beside her elbow. That part in the middle, she said, leaning slightly toward Nolan's table, pointing at the structure. How does it not fall down? Nolan's hand stilled. He looked at the structure, then, and it was slight. It was almost nothing. It was the equivalent of a door moving a millimeter. He looked at Ivy. Not for long. A brief direct look, the quality of it totally different from the data-gathering blankness he'd turned on Victor. This was something else. Something that had recognition in it, or the beginning of recognition. The particular attention you give someone who has asked a question that reveals they are actually looking at the same thing you're looking at. He looked back at the structure. His finger moved, slowly, just the one finger, to indicate the alternating horizontal layers at the foundation. "Oh?" Ivy said. She leaned closer. "It's because they go sideways?" Nolan's finger moved again, twice, a kind of tracing of the logic. "Like bricks," Ivy said. "My dad showed me that. When you stack bricks, you go sideways so they don't all fall the same direction." Darius was not looking at his son. He was looking at the tabletop in front of him, watching from his peripheral vision, keeping his face quiet, keeping his body still, keeping everything in himself that wanted to reach toward this moment, carefully and completely contained. Boone, across the table, had also gone very still. He had, Darius suspected, understood immediately what was happening. Nolan was communicating, not in words, in gesture, in indication, in the careful economy of small movements that was the language he'd built for himself in the silence. But he was communicating. He was choosing to communicate, with a child he had never met, in a cafe where 30 minutes ago his carefully constructed world had been violently disrupted on a Tuesday afternoon that had swung to the edge of something terrible, and then, through the held stillness of a man pressing his hands against worn oak and breathing, swung back. "Is it hard?" Ivy asked. "To build them?" Nolan considered this for a moment, then he gave a very small shrug, which was, Darius felt it detonate quietly inside his chest, the first social gesture his son had made toward another child in 22 months. A shrug. One small lifting and dropping of the shoulders, the universal gesture of, not that hard, but not nothing either. The gesture of someone who had an opinion about difficulty and had decided, in this instance, to share it. Ivy nodded seriously. "I couldn't do it," she said. I'm not patient enough." She said this without any self-pity, as a simple fact, the way you'd note the color of a wall. "My mom says patience is something you practice. Do you practice?" Nolan looked at his hands, then at the structure. Darius watched his son's face cycle through something internal and invisible, from the outside but present in the small shifts of his expression, the particular quality of his stillness changing. Then Nolan picked up a sugar packet from the spare pile. He set it on the edge of the table between them, close to Ivy's side. Ivy looked at the sugar packet, then at Nolan. Something lit up in her face, the specific delight of a child who has been invited to participate in something she was watching from the outside. She picked it up carefully. "Where?" she said. Nolan pointed to a spot on the structure's second tier. Ivy placed the packet with enormous concentration, tongue slightly out, adjusting twice. It held. She looked up with the expression of someone who had just completed something personally monumental. "I did it." Darius pressed his hands hard against the table. He was not going to cry in a cafe. He was not going to cry in front of Boone. He was not going to cry in front of his son, who needed him steady. He was not. He breathed in through his nose. He looked at the far wall, where someone had hung a large piece of abstract art in rust and amber and deep green, and he catalogued it. The brushstrokes, the texture, the way the rust color bled into the amber at the edges. And he breathed out. Boone, across the table, was doing something very similar, though his version was directed at his coffee cup and slightly more successful. "Can I do another one?" Ivy asked. Nolan pointed to a different spot. She went for it. For the next several minutes, the cafe moved quietly around them. The ordinary sounds rebuilding themselves, the espresso machine, the murmured conversations, Priya's even voice at the counter. And at the corner table, a small boy and a small girl rebuilt a sugar castle together, one packet at a time, while two men who had survived harder things than this particular afternoon sat across from them and said nothing, because nothing was necessary, and the silence was, for the first time in a very long time, full instead of empty. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was changing, going gold and long the way it did in early October, painting the sidewalk in strips of amber. A couple walked past with a stroller. A man in a delivery uniform locked his bike to the signpost on the corner. An ordinary afternoon continuing its business. Inside Ember and Ground, Victor Lang's business card sat untouched on the edge of the table. Darius had not looked at it since it was set there. He would probably deal with it eventually. There would be decisions to make about it, whether to discard it, whether to contact the man, whether there was anything worth pursuing in that direction. But that was a later decision, for a quieter moment, when he had the bandwidth to think it through. Right now, his son was pointing at a section of the third tier and watching Ivy place a sugar packet with the full, unguarded attention of a child who had decided that this specific other child was trustworthy. And Darius was watching that, and Boone was watching all of it, and the cafe was warm, and the afternoon was gold outside the window, and the castle was going up. When Ivy's mother looked up from her phone to check on her daughter, and found Ivy deeply absorbed in collaborative architecture with the quiet boy at the next table, she caught Darius's eye and gave him a smile, different from the nod she'd given earlier. That one had been sympathy. This one was something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. The specific smile of a parent watching their child be, without hesitation, exactly who they hoped they were raising them to be. Darius nodded once. Nolan reached for another sugar packet and placed it at the very top of the structure, the highest point yet, balanced with extraordinary care on the apex of the third tier. It wobbled slightly. He held his breath. The packet stabilized. Settled. He sat back. The castle stood. It was taller than the first one, different in design, wider at the base. The crosshatch foundation distributing the weight more evenly, 3 distinct tiers stepping inward with the logic of something that had been built by someone who had learned from a failure and applied that knowledge going forward. 2 small builders' hands had made it, one directing and one assisting, and it stood in the afternoon light on the table of a cafe on Birch and Holloway, improbable and exact. Ivy looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who had contributed to something larger than herself. "We should put something on top," she said, "like a flag." She looked around the table. Her eyes settled on her picture book, which she had abandoned 20 minutes ago. She opened it to the back and side cover, tore out a corner of blank end paper with careful hands, folded it twice, and looked at it for a moment. Then she leaned across and placed it very gently at the peak of the castle. A paper flag. Impermanent. Perfect. Nolan looked at it for a long moment, and then Nolan Kane smiled. It was small, careful. The smile of a boy who had learned to be cautious with his expressions, who had kept everything internal for so long that the muscles that made it move slowly, like a mechanism that hadn't been used in a while but was, at this particular moment, being asked to run. But it was real. It was completely, devastatingly real. Darius saw it in his peripheral vision and looked at the far wall and counted brushstrokes and breathed, and somewhere under the amber and the rust and the deep green, he felt something he hadn't felt in 22 months, something small and exact and undeniable, something that had no name he trusted but that lived in the same register as hope, beginning, against all expectation and against all the evidence of the last 2 years, to move. Part 3. Lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phủ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không Việt lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 10:59. The smile lasted maybe 4 seconds. That was enough. Darius had learned, in the particular school of the last 22 months, that the measurement of progress was not in duration but in occurrence. The smile happened. It was real. It had moved across his son's face with the slow, careful quality of something that had not been used in a long time, but had not, as it turned out, forgotten how. 4 seconds was not nothing. 4 seconds for a boy who had been living behind glass was a long time. He did not comment on it, did not reach across the table and squeeze Nolan's shoulder, or say there it is, or do any of the things that the feeling inside him was insisting he do. He looked at the far wall for another beat, memorized another section of the abstract painting's rust and amber edge, and then looked back at the table in his usual way. Present, quiet, unhurried. As if smiles happened here all the time, as if this were entirely ordinary. The lie of ordinariness was, he had come to understand, one of the most important things he could offer his son. Ivy's mother, whose name turned out to be Claire, had long since put her phone away. She and Darius exchanged a brief conversation across the small distance between their tables, the kind of conversation that happens easily between parents who are watching their children do something good and feel the shared ownership of that moment. She asked how old Nolan was. Darius told her. She said Ivy was 7. She said they lived on Crestwood, 2 streets over. She said they sometimes walked through this neighborhood on Saturday afternoons. She said it without any particular emphasis, but it was clearly an offering, the adult equivalent of Nolan indicating where to place the next sugar packet. Darius said they were usually around on Saturdays. He said it simply, without commitment pressure, leaving it the same way she had left it, available if wanted. Boone listened to all of this with the expression of someone who found something quietly satisfying about what he was witnessing. He finished his coffee. He did not check his phone. He sat at the table with Darius and Nolan the way he had always known how to sit in difficult places, fully present, without fidgeting, without manufacturing purpose, content to occupy whatever was asked of the moment. Around them, the cafe had settled fully back into itself. The woman in scrubs had paid her bill and left, pausing at their table on her way out to say, to Darius, simply, "You handled that well." She said it the way medical people sometimes speak, direct, declarative, with the slight distance of someone who delivers assessments for a living. Darius thanked her. She nodded and went out the door. The older couple by the window stayed another 20 minutes, long enough for the man, white-haired, probably in his mid-70s, with the deliberate upright bearing of someone who had once been in uniform of some variety, to pass their table on his way to the counter and rest his hand briefly on Darius's shoulder as he went by. He said nothing, just the hand on the shoulder. The gesture that says, "I saw, I know, well done." Darius felt it go through him like a current. The college kid with the headphones left without looking up. Though Darius noticed, when Priya cleared his table 20 minutes later, that he had left a $10 bill weighted under his coffee cup when his total had been $3.50. People, Darius thought, were strange and private and frequently better than they appeared. It was Nolan who, finally and without any solicitation, pointed at the paper flag at the peak of the sugar castle and then pointed at Ivy. She looked at him. "You want me to have it?" He pointed again. Ivy carefully unfolded the paper flag from its position at the apex, taking exceptional care not to disturb the structure below it, which remained standing with a solidity that seemed to slightly exceed what sugar packets ought to be capable of. She held the folded square of end paper for a moment, turning it over in her hands. Then she put it in the pocket of her flower-embroidered jacket. "I'll keep it," she said, with the gravity of a child making a genuine commitment. Nolan looked at the castle without its flag. Then he looked at Darius. And in the look, in the particular quality of it, the way his eyes asked something without the mechanism of words, Darius read a question he had not been asked in over a year and a half. "Can we stay a little longer?" "We've got time," Darius said. Nolan turned back to the castle. Boone looked at Darius across the table. He had been watching the exchange with the same attention he'd given everything in the last hour. Complete, unhurried, missing nothing. Now, in the restored quiet, he leaned forward slightly and set his elbows on the table. "How's work?" he said. It was a question so ordinary that it almost startled Darius, the deliberate normality of it, the pivot from the weight of the last hour to something plain and answerable. "Good," Darius said. And then, because Boone's directness had always made him more direct, "Better than good lately. I've been getting more custom work. Furniture, mostly. Built a credenza for a woman in the Marchmont district last month that she cried when she saw it. He paused. She'd described exactly what she wanted, and I had figured out how to do something she hadn't described that made it better. And when she saw it, she cried. That's the work, Boone said. Yeah. Serena would have loved that story. The sentence landed without warning. Not cruelly. It was offered with the ease of a man who had learned that the dead don't need to be protected from mention, that keeping them out of conversation was its own kind of harm. But it landed. She would have, Darius said. He let it sit there. Didn't push it away or hurry past it. Just let it be what it was. True and painful, and proof that the person it was about had been real and present and irreplaceable. She always cried at exactly the right things. Never the sentimental ones. The real ones. Boone nodded. I met her once, at the unit reunion in, 6 years ago? 7. She talked to Rodriguez for 45 minutes about art history. Rodriguez, who as far as I knew had never looked at a painting in his life. Darius laughed. It was short and surprised, the kind of laugh that happens before you decide whether you're going to allow it. And by the time he'd decided, it was already over. But it was real. She did that to everyone. She'd find the one subject you'd been storing without knowing it, and she'd open it up. He was quiet for a moment. Nolan has that, the way he looks at people. He sees the same way she did. Boone looked at Nolan, who was making minute adjustments to the castle's second tier, pressing each packet millimeters into alignment with the concentration of someone for whom precision was a form of expression. How's the therapy going? Boone asked. Dr. Mills says he's progressing, in his own direction, at his own pace, which is what she said it would be. Darius moved his coffee cup a quarter inch. Sometimes I think he's further along inside than he shows. Like there's a lot happening behind the glass that we can't see yet. I think you're right, Boone said. He nodded slightly toward the castle, toward the crosshatch foundation that Nolan had designed after the first one was destroyed. The architectural revision that spoke of a mind processing failure and responding with adaptation rather than withdrawal. That's not the work of a boy who's shut down. No, Darius agreed. It's not. He had thought about this often, the way Nolan's silence had a quality to it that Dr. Mills had been careful to distinguish from certain other clinical presentations. It was not the blankness of dissociation or the flatness of depression, though the grief was real and had done real damage. It was, as nearly as Darius could tell from the inside, something closer to the silence of someone in deep concentration. The silence of a person who had decided at a fundamental level to process everything very thoroughly before speaking, because the last time the world had broken without warning, words had been inadequate, and he had run out of them. He wanted to make sure, before he spoke again, that he had the right ones. Darius understood that. More than he had ever told Dr. Mills, more than he had told anyone, he understood that from the inside. They stayed at Ember and Ground for another 40 minutes. Ivy and her mother, Claire, stayed almost as long. Claire reading, eventually, and Ivy and Nolan engaged in the particular quiet industry of children who have found a shared project and don't require adult facilitation. Ivy talked. Nolan listened and indicated, a pointed finger, a repositioned packet, the small, nonverbal vocabulary he'd been developing in the space where spoken language used to be. Ivy interpreted all of it without difficulty, with the natural fluency of a child who simply refused to be deterred by the absence of conventional response. When Claire finally gathered their things to go, Ivy stood and looked at the castle for a long, serious moment. Don't let anyone knock it over again, she said. She directed this at Nolan. Not at Darius, not at Boone. At Nolan, with the directness and simplicity that Darius was coming to understand was simply her character. A child who located the relevant person in any situation and addressed them. Nolan looked at her. Then he put one finger on the edge of the table, a deliberate gesture, barely above stillness. But it was a gesture to her, an acknowledgement, a receipt. Ivy nodded, satisfied, as if a pact had been made. She followed her mother out. At the door, she turned back briefly, found Nolan's eyes across the cafe, and raised one hand, not exactly a wave, more like a salute. Then she was gone. Darius sat with the aftermath of that exchange for a moment and felt the ghost of the earlier laugh in his chest, mixed now with something older and more complicated and harder to name. Boone pushed back his chair about 10 minutes later. He stood, straightened his shirt, checked his watch. "I should get to my daughter's before the kids go to bed," he said. He looked at Nolan. "It was good to meet you, Nolan. That's a fine castle." He put his hand briefly on Darius's shoulder. The same gesture the old man by the window had used, but deeper in history, weighted with 11 years of things they had been through together in places that had no civilian translation. "Come by sometime. Maggie would like to see you. The kids would lose their minds over that woodwork you do." "I will," Darius said. And this time, unlike the last several times he'd said "I will" to various invitations over the past 2 years, he meant it. Boone nodded once. He walked to the door with the same unhurried directness with which he'd walked across the cafe 3 hours ago, or 2 hours ago, or whatever the actual time was, because time had moved strangely this afternoon, contracting and expanding in a way that had more to do with the density of what had happened than with the clock. The bell above the door made its normal sound as he went. Darius and Nolan sat alone at the corner table. The cafe had thinned to just a few other occupied tables now. The afternoon had gone fully to gold outside the windows, the October light doing what it did at this hour, going long and deep and amber-saturated, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they're lit from inside. The street outside was doing its late afternoon thing, the uptick in foot traffic as people came home from work, the particular rhythm of a neighborhood returning to itself. Darius leaned back in his chair and looked at his son. Nolan was still at his castle. He had made a few more additions after Ivy left. A small secondary structure to the right of the main building, connected by a bridge of horizontal packets. An expansion, a new wing. "You've been busy," Darius said. Nolan didn't look up, but the shoulders settled in the familiar way. "How are you feeling?" No response, but the hands kept moving, steady and deliberate. Darius watched him for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in a while. He reached out and carefully picked up one of the remaining sugar packets from the dish and held it, turning it in his fingers. "I used to build things when I was your age," he said. "Not with sugar packets. With dirt, mostly. I'd make these walls in the backyard. Forts, I called them, but they were really just walls. My mom would come out and ask what I was doing, and I'd say I was building a fort, and she'd say that a fort needed a roof, and I'd say the sky was the roof." He paused. She never argued with that. She'd just stand there a minute and then go back inside. He set the sugar packet on the table. Nolan's hands paused for a fraction of a second, the listening pause, and then resumed. "Your grandmother called this morning," Darius said. "My mom. She wants to know when she can see you. She said, and this is a direct quote, that she has made your favorite cornbread twice already this month just practicing, which I'm pretty sure means she wants you to know she's ready to make it for real when you come over." Something shifted in Nolan's posture. Slight. The corners of his mouth moved, not to a smile exactly, to the edge of one. "I told her soon," Darius said. "I think soon is actually true." He watched his son's hands, watched the bridge of packets connecting the main structure to the new wing, watched how Nolan had calibrated the height of the secondary structure to match the first tier of the main castle rather than the full height, which created a kind of visual asymmetry that was, Darius thought, actually more interesting than pure symmetry would have been. "You changed the design this time," Darius said, after he knocked it over. He chose not to say Victor's name. "You built it wider at the bottom, different layers." Nolan looked at the structure for a moment. "That's engineering," Darius said. "You figure out why something failed and you build it to not fail that way again." He leaned his forearms on the table. "That's also pretty much life in general. Build, something breaks it, figure out why, build again differently." He looked at the castle. "You're good at it." He meant both things, and he thought Nolan understood that he meant both things. Outside, a gust of wind pushed a small swirl of leaves along the sidewalk. The first real evidence of autumn making its intentions clear, the leaves still orange-edged, not yet fully turned. A woman walked past with a dog that stopped and pressed its nose to the glass at street level, fogging it briefly, then was pulled onward. "Nolan," Darius said. Nolan looked at him. Directly, fully, the way he had looked at Boone when Boone asked about the building. The way he had looked at Ivy when she asked where to place the next packet. The full-level gaze of a child who had decided to see exactly what was in front of him. Darius held that gaze and felt, as he always did when Nolan looked at him this directly, The simultaneous presence of grief and love in a mixture so complete that he had stopped trying to separate them. They were the same current at this point, the same frequency. He loved his son with the specific intensity of someone who had lost the other half of the family they'd built and had decided, without making it a decision, because it had never been a choice, that love was the only orientation that made any sense. "I'm proud of you today," Darius said. "Not because of what happened with that man. I'm proud of you every day. That's just the baseline. But today specifically, the way you kept going, the way you started building again." He paused. "And the way you talked to Ivy." He kept his face still and his voice even on those last words. "The way you talked to Ivy." Deliberately normalizing the term, folding the gesture language into the same category as spoken language. Because it was, and had always been, communication. And Darius Kane was not going to be the person who made his son feel like what he had been doing for 2 years was lesser than words. Nolan looked at the castle. Then he looked at his father again. And then Nolan Kane opened his mouth. What came out was not a word. It was a sound, small and rough. The sound of a vocal mechanism that had been dormant and was running for the first time in a long time, like an engine turning over. It was breathy and uncertain, and it lasted less than a second. But it was deliberate. It was an attempt. Darius pressed his hands against the table. He held everything in himself absolutely still. The room, his breathing, his expression, the feeling that was detonating quietly behind his ribcage. And he waited. Nolan's face did something complicated, something between the effort of the attempt and a kind of surprise, as if the sound had emerged slightly ahead of the intention, and he was taking stock of what had just happened. He looked at the castle. He looked at his father. He looked at the place on the table where the paper flag had been before Ivy took it. And then he tried again. The sound this time was more shaped, still rough, still careful. The sound of something finding its edges for the first time in a very long time, testing what was possible, reading the air of the room the way his eyes had been reading everything all afternoon, for safety, for stability, for evidence that what he produced would be received with steadiness rather than shock. Darius did not move. Did not lean forward, did not change his expression. He gave Nolan what Nolan had needed from the beginning of all of this, the complete, unconditional stillness of someone who was not going anywhere and not going to be shattered by whatever came next. He was Nolan's foundation. He had been since the beginning. The sound Nolan made a third time was, almost, a syllable. Priya, behind the counter, had been wiping down the espresso machine. She had stopped. She was very still, facing away from them, not watching, giving them the privacy of her turned back, but entirely present, entirely attentive, the way people become when they sense that something important is taking place nearby. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle now, painting the table in that deep amber, catching the edges of the sugar packets in a way that made them briefly luminous. The castle stood in its own light. Darius thought about Serena. Not in the sharp, intrusive way that grief sometimes arrived, the ambush of a smell or a song lyric, or the angle of a light that was suddenly and devastatingly the same light as some ordinary Tuesday from 6 years ago. This was different. This was a thought he was choosing, a conversation he was having with her in the part of himself where those conversations still happened. "Look," he told her, "look at him." He thought she would have been sitting beside him right now, her long, careful fingers wrapped around her coffee, her eyes doing what they always did when she was trying not to show how much she was feeling, going slightly too still, fixing on something at middle distance, that particular effort she made to contain herself that had always been entirely transparent to him. She would have been failing at containing herself. He almost was too. Nolan's hands were flat on the table. He wasn't touching the castle. He was sitting with the stillness of someone gathering something from deep inside, something that had been kept down for so long that the retrieval required the full attention of everything he had. The cafe was very quiet, and then in the golden October afternoon light of ember and ground, in the corner table that was theirs every Tuesday, in the room where something terrible had been done and something extraordinary had followed, Nolan Kane looked at his father and said, rough and slow and with an effort that cost everything he had, a single word. "Daddy." The sound of it was imperfect, hoarse with disuse, the 2 syllables slightly uneven, the vowels stretched by the effort of production. It sounded like a word that had been kept in a dark place for a very long time and was now, for the first time, seeing light. It was the most beautiful sound Darius Kane had ever heard in his life. He didn't move for 1 second. 2. He was performing the same calibration he always performed, giving Nolan the stability of his response, not collapsing into the feeling but inhabiting it with full presence. He was a man trained to manage what happened inside him in extreme circumstances. He had never imagined that the most extreme circumstance he would ever face would be this. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out low and even, and only the very slight roughness in it, barely perceptible, present if you knew where to listen, gave anything away. "I'm here." Nolan looked at him. "I'm right here," Darius said. And then, because he was a man who had learned to let the hard things land without flinching from them, who had been practicing that skill for 2 years in the private company of a child who needed someone unflinching, he leaned forward slightly, put his hand on the table between them, not reaching for Nolan, not pulling him in, just putting it there, available, and said, "You can keep going if you want to, or not. We've got time." Nolan looked at his father's hand on the table. He put his own hand over it, not gripping, just resting. The small, warm weight of it, barely there, and entirely enormous. Priya wiped the same section of the espresso machine for the 4th time and found something to do that took her to the back of the counter. Outside, the wind moved through the October street, and a piece of amber light moved across the floor of the cafe, and the sugar castle stood in its corner of the table, wide at the base and cross-hatched and carefully built. A structure that had been destroyed once today and rebuilt better, by a pair of hands that understood, at whatever level 6-year-old hands understand things, that the purpose of knowing how something falls is to know how to make it stand. Nolan's hand rested on his father's hand. Neither of them moved. The light changed very slowly. Time, which had been doing strange things all afternoon, going dense and slow in some moments and thin and fast in others, settled now into something that felt less like measurement and more like presence, not duration, depth. The kind of moment that doesn't want to be counted, only inhabited. Darius did not know how long they sat like that. He would not have been able to say later, with any precision, long enough that the last of the golden afternoon light shifted towards something cooler and more blue, long enough that the cafe around them went through the small ritual of its end-of-day transition. The music shifting slightly, Priya starting to stack clean cups. Long enough for something to change, not visibly. Not in any way that a camera would have captured if one had been pointed at them. Just the particular change that happens inside a room, and inside 2 people. When a door that has been closed for a long time has moved, finally and undeniably, in its frame. It was not fully open. Darius understood that. He had not expected it to be. The work of this was not the work of an afternoon, however extraordinary the afternoon had been. There were more mornings ahead, more Tuesday castles, more sessions with Dr. Mills, more nights when Nolan's silence would press against the walls of the apartment, and Darius would sit in the hallway outside his son's room and listen to his breathing and remind himself, as he had been reminding himself for 22 months, that presence was the most important thing, that the ground being firm underfoot was the gift, that sometimes the best thing a person could do for someone they loved was to simply stay. But the door had moved. One word, Daddy, rough and imperfect, and costing everything, and more real than anything he had heard in 2 years. The door had moved. And Darius Kane, who had been trained to withstand extraordinary things and had withstood more ordinary devastation than any of that training had prepared him for, sat at the corner table of ember and ground with his son's hand resting on his, and understood that the worst of it was behind them, not gone. Never entirely gone. The loss of Serena was not a thing that would resolve, and he was not naive enough to think otherwise. But grief was not the only thing in the room anymore. It hadn't been the only thing in the room all afternoon. Something else had been building alongside it, patient and cross-hatched, and wider at the base than anyone looking at it quickly would have thought, and it was standing now in the afternoon light. Improbable. Exact. Standing. He turned his hand under Nolan so that their palms were together, his large, work-rough hand in his son's small, precise one. And he felt the slight pressure as Nolan held on, and he thought, this is what I was built for in the end, not the other things. This. Outside the window, the first streetlight of the evening came on. Part 4, Louis. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 11:09. The streetlight outside had been on for 20 minutes before Darius finally said quietly, "We should head home." Nolan did not resist. He looked at the castle one more time, the rebuilt structure with its wide crosshatch base and its 3 careful tiers standing in the thin blue evening light that had replaced the amber of the afternoon. He looked at it the way you look at something you've made when you're deciding whether it's finished. Then he took his hand back from his father's, placed it flat on the table beside the structure, and left it there for a moment. A goodbye. Darius recognized it as one. He signaled Priya, who came over with the check and also, without being asked, a small paper bag. 2 cookies, she said, for the road. She said it to Nolan specifically, looking directly at him, the same way she always did. No special emphasis, no heightened gentleness, just the ordinary transactional warmth of someone who had decided that the most respectful thing she could offer was to treat him the same as every other small person who came through her door. Same time next week? Nolan looked at her. Then he nodded. It was a small thing. A single inclination of the head, barely more than a dip of the chin. But it was a response to a direct question offered to a person outside his immediate family, in public, without prompting from his father. Priya received it with the same even professionalism she'd maintained throughout the entire extraordinary afternoon. "See you then," she said, and went back to the counter. Darius held Nolan's jacket for him, a navy blue quilted thing with a hood that Nolan had selected himself from a rack at a second-hand shop 3 months ago, one of the small assertions of preference that had been emerging in him like the first green of early spring, tentative but insistent. Nolan put his arms through the sleeves and Darius settled it across his shoulders and zipped it to the collar, and for a moment they were in the ordinary physical space of a father dressing a child for the cold, and it was so entirely normal that it ached. They left the castle on the table. This was their routine. They never took it down themselves, leaving it instead for Priya to clear when she needed the table, which had always struck Darius as the right way to treat something built with that kind of care. You didn't dismantle your own castle. You left it standing as long as the world allowed. Outside, the air had the particular quality of early October evenings in this part of the city, cold enough to register through a jacket, but not yet fully decided about winter, carrying the smell of turned leaves and exhaust, and something from the Korean restaurant 2 doors down that Darius's stomach registered with involuntary interest. The street was in its dinner-hour rhythm, the sidewalk carrying a different population than the afternoons, people moving with purpose, heading somewhere specific, the brief daily migration between work and home. Nolan walked beside him, not ahead, not lagging, but beside, which was itself a development of the last few months. For a long time after the accident, Nolan had walked slightly behind Darius, maintaining a specific distance from his father's back in a way that Dr. Mills had explained was a trauma response, the impulse to keep a safe object in the visual field at all times. The shift to walking beside had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, the distance decreasing over weeks until one day Darius had looked down and realized his son was simply next to him, in the ordinary way of a child and a parent sharing a sidewalk. He had not said anything about it. He had kept walking. Now Nolan's hand came up and found Darius's hand in the dark between them. and Darius took it. The familiar grip, small and warm. The particular way Nolan's fingers wrapped around his thumb rather than his fingers, because Darius's hands were large enough to make that the natural hold. They walked that way down Birch Street, past the Korean restaurant, and the dry cleaner with the handwritten sign in the window, and the small independent pharmacy where the owner, Mr. Osei, always kept a bowl of hard candies on the counter and had been handing them to Nolan since he was 3. They did not stop at Mr. Osei's tonight. The pharmacy was dark, closed early for some reason, a hand-lettered note taped inside the glass that Darius couldn't read from the sidewalk. "He's probably fine," Darius said, catching Nolan's glance at the dark window. "Probably a family thing." Nolan looked at the dark window a moment longer, then looked forward and kept walking. Darius felt the small weight of that exchange, the fact that Nolan had looked at him when Darius spoke, that there had been a visible processing of what he'd said, a small adjustment of the concern on Nolan's face. Conversation. The raw material of it, at least. The back and forth of two people in a shared world, one observing something and one responding to the observation, and both of them carrying it forward together. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on the corner of Sycamore and 11th. A 6-story brick building with an elevator that was reliable about 80% of the time, and stairs that Darius kept meaning to complain about to the building management, because the 3rd-floor landing light had been out for 6 weeks. Tonight the elevator worked. They rode it up in the particular silence of elevator rides, Nolan leaning slightly against Darius's side the way he sometimes did in enclosed spaces. Not anxiously, just a lean, the easy physical closeness of a child who knew where safe was. The apartment smelled like the morning's coffee and sawdust, and underneath both of those, something fainter and indefinable that Darius had given up trying to analyze. It was just the smell of home. It had taken him a long time to think of it as that, home, after the accident. For months it had felt like a place he was staying, temporary and slightly provisional, because home had been something the 4 of them had built together, him and Serena and Nolan and the life they'd been assembling, and the 3 of them version felt like an entirely different architecture. But it had become home again, slowly. Over many months of cooking and bedtime and school mornings and Saturday projects, over the gradual accumulation of new ordinary things layered on top of the grief, the apartment had resumed being a place that belonged to them, rather than simply a place they occupied. He hung up Nolan's jacket, switched on the lamp in the living room, which sent a warm, low circle of light across the couch and the coffee table and the bookshelf that covered the entire south wall. Serena's books mostly, though Darius had added to them, because it had seemed important not to let the shelf become a museum. New books alongside hers. Living books and memorial books coexisting on the same shelves, the way living people and the memory of people who were gone coexisted in a family that was still, against everything, a family. Nolan went directly to the coffee table where his current project lived. This was the birdhouse. He'd started it 3 weeks ago, after watching Darius work in the small back room that served as a workshop. The room where Darius kept his tools and his lumber and his plans, and where, on off hours, he made things for the pleasure of making them rather than for clients. Nolan had watched his father build for months without participating, sitting on the stool in the corner with the quiet attention of someone attending a master class. Then, 3 weeks ago, he had pointed at a piece of scrap pine on the bench. Darius had looked at the wood, looked at his son. "You want to build something?" Nolan had looked at the wood. "Okay," Darius had said. "What do you want to make?" Nolan had looked around the workshop. On the windowsill there was a small ceramic bird that Serena had bought at a craft fair years ago, a bluebird, crude and charming, that had lived on various windowsills in various apartments they'd shared. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at Darius. "A birdhouse," Darius had said. "Sure." The project had been proceeding at Nolan's pace, which was the only pace Darius was interested in. He had cut the wood into the necessary pieces, letting Nolan watch, and when Nolan had reached for the measuring tape with clear intention, letting him take the measurements, guiding his hands without taking over. The walls and floor and roof pieces were complete, and had been for a week. The assembly was what Nolan was working on now, gluing and pressing, working section by section with a patience that Darius thought was probably genetic on both sides, because Serena had been the same way with a project she cared about. Darius went to the kitchen. He stood at the counter for a moment, looking at what was available. He had done a reasonable grocery run on Sunday. There was chicken in the refrigerator, onions, rice, the particular combination of spices he'd been using since Serena had written down her jerk chicken marinade on an index card that now lived inside the kitchen cabinet door, slightly spotted with oil, its ink still clear. He could make that. He'd been making it regularly for the last year, each time iterating slightly, trying to get it to the place where it matched his memory of hers, which he was not sure was possible but was worth attempting. He took out the chicken and the onion and set them on the cutting board. From the living room there was the sound of Nolan at the coffee table, the small sounds of careful work, the tap of wood on wood, the slight scrape of something being positioned and repositioned. Darius began cutting the onion. "We're having chicken tonight," he said, raising his voice slightly to carry to the living room. "Grandma called it practicing. I call it feeding us." From the living room, nothing. The small sounds of the birdhouse. Then, and Darius's knife paused for a fraction of a second before resuming its motion, a sound, not a word. More like an affirmative sound. The small back of the throat hum that means okay, or I heard you, or simply yes, the most basic possible unit of vocal response. The kind of sound people make dozens of times a day without thinking about it. For Nolan, it was a choice. Darius kept cutting the onion. He kept his face toward the cutting board and his hands steady and his breathing even, and he felt the warmth of that small sound move through him the way the streetlight outside had seemed to move through the window earlier. Something coming on that had been dark for a long time, gradual and then undeniable. "Good," he said. Just that. Making it easy, making it ordinary, making it part of the normal texture of a weeknight kitchen. He put the chicken in the marinade. He went to the living room doorway and leaned against the frame, drying his hands on a dish towel. Nolan was on his stomach on the floor with the birdhouse in front of him, a small bottle of wood glue beside his elbow, two pieces of the structure held firmly together while the glue set. His tongue was slightly out, the effort marker, the concentration tell. "How's the roof piece fitting?" Darius asked. Nolan looked up. He looked at the roof piece, which was lying to the side waiting for the walls to be secured. He made a small gesture with his chin toward the joint he was currently pressing, the front wall, which he'd been fussing about the alignment of for 3 days. "Still not flat?" Darius asked. Nolan pressed his lips together slightly. Approximately. His version of almost. "Bring it to the workshop after dinner," Darius said. "We'll look at it under the good light." Nolan nodded. Darius pushed off the doorframe and went back to the kitchen. He started the rice. He thought about the afternoon, the way it was still moving through him, the way things that have happened to you take time to fully arrive, cycling back and depositing themselves in layers rather than all at once. Victor Lang's palm against his cheek. The cold precision that had come awake inside him and the specific cost of not following it. Boone's voice from across the cafe. The sugar packets scattered across dark hardwood. Ivy's flower-embroidered jacket and her matter-of-fact pact with his son. The paper flag on top of the castle. Nolan's smile. Daddy. He stirred the rice and felt the word move through him again. Its rough imperfection. The 2 syllables that had cost everything and been worth everything. The proof that whatever door had been closed was not locked. His phone was on the counter. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment. He had Boone's number. Had always had it, though they'd spoken rarely in the last 2 years. Occasionally and briefly, the way people who have been through things together maintain a low-frequency contact that persists through periods of silence because the silence is understood. He opened a text message and typed, "Thank you for today. I mean it." He looked at it, then added, "Tell Maggie we'll come by soon." Nolan said his first word today. He paused with his thumb over the send button for a moment, then sent it. He set the phone down. From the living room, the small sounds continued. 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed. "Boone." "I know he did. I heard it from the back of the cafe. Give him hell, Darius." Then, after a beat, "Maggie will make the kids clean their rooms when she hears that." Then, "Good man. Good father. Get some sleep tonight." Darius set the phone down and stood at the stove with the chicken going in the pan and the rice simmering and the apartment filling with the smell of his wife's recipe and his own work. And he pressed the heels of his hands against the counter, and he let himself, briefly and without performance, feel the full weight of the day. All of it. The threat of it, and the grief under the threat, and the restraint that had cost. and the extraordinary unplanned gift of Boone walking across that cafe, and Ivy and her paper flag, and the castle standing in the October light, and Nolan's hand on his. And the word, the one word, the door moving, he let all of it arrive. Then he exhaled, long and slow, and rolled his shoulders back and went back to cooking. That was, he had found, the way through most things. You let them arrive. You gave them their full weight. And then you went back to cooking because there was a child in the next room who was going to be hungry in about 20 minutes, and the rice needed watching. He was plating the food when Nolan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd left the birdhouse on the coffee table. Walls glued, presumably, the joint finally satisfied with its alignment or given up on until morning. He stood in the doorway in his socks and his school sweatshirt, looking at the food with the expression of genuine interest that Darius had learned to read as hunger in his particular child, because Nolan didn't perform hunger the way some children didn't say I'm starving or make elaborate theater of his stomach. He just looked at the food with his full attention. 2 minutes, Darius said. Nolan went to his seat at the kitchen table, the one on the left, the window side, which had been his seat since they moved into the apartment 4 years ago. He pulled out the chair and sat, and put his hands on the table and waited with the practiced patience of a boy who had been told 2 minutes and understood it to mean approximately 2 minutes, because his father was a man whose relationship with time was precise rather than approximate. Darius set the plates down. He poured Nolan's water and his own, sat across the table, and they ate. The kitchen window looked out on the alley behind the building, which was not scenic, but which caught a strip of sky that Darius had come to appreciate over the years. A narrow rectangle of whatever the sky was doing, visible from the table. Tonight, it was a deep blue-gray, the last of the day's light compressed along the bottom edge. A single star already out at the top. He watched it while he ate. Nolan watched his food, which was another thing that hadn't changed. Nolan ate with the same focused attention he brought to building, working through what was on his plate with systematic purpose. They were halfway through dinner when Nolan looked up. Darius met his eyes. Nolan looked at his plate, then at his father. Something in his expression was working itself toward something. That look Darius had come to know, the look of interior processing made visible at its edges, the tell of a question forming in the place where questions lived. Darius waited. Nolan opened his mouth, closed it. A muscle moved in his jaw. The effort. Then, why? Just that. Single syllable. Rough-edged, clearly effortful, but unambiguous. A word. A question without the full apparatus of the question. Why? Darius set his fork down. He looked at his son across the table, across the plates of jerked chicken and rice, across the 2 glasses of water, across the narrow kitchen table that had been in 3 apartments and was slightly scarred along one edge where Nolan, at age 4, had discovered that a crayon dragged firmly along wood makes a mark that doesn't come out. He looked at him with the complete level attention he had been bringing to every moment of this particular afternoon, which had been, he was coming to understand, not a single afternoon at all, but the culmination of something that had been building for 22 months, crosshatched and wider at the base than anyone had seen. Why didn't I hit him? Darius said. Nolan looked at him. Yes. Darius was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, because the answer had several layers and he was deciding where to start. Which layer was the right first layer for a 6-year-old boy who had just asked his first direct question in nearly 2 years and deserved a real one back? Because you were there, he said. Nolan looked at him steadily. That's the first reason, Darius said, and it's the most important one. Not because I needed to protect you from seeing violence, though I did want that, but because... He paused, organized what he was trying to say, which was something he'd thought about in various forms for years but had never tried to put into plain words. Because the most important thing you're ever going to learn from me isn't in anything I tell you. It's in what you watch me do. He picked up his fork, then set it down again. I couldn't teach you about strength by breaking that man in half in a cafe, even though I could have. Especially because I could have. The lesson gets lost if the teacher uses the wrong tool. Nolan was listening with his full body. The stillness that was different from the withdrawn stillness of grief, the active stillness of someone taking something in. The second reason, Darius said, is that what he did was small. He was a small man trying to use a large gesture to feel like he had power because somewhere inside him, he doesn't believe he actually does. Hitting him back would have made it into something equal. It wasn't equal. He was small and I was bigger than that, and the way to show it was to stay bigger. He watched Nolan process this, watched the dark eyes move slightly, the way they did when something was being filed. The third reason, Darius said, and his voice changed slightly on this one, dropped lower, went quieter, the register he used when he was telling Nolan something that came from deeper than ordinary conversation, is that I made a decision a long time ago that I wasn't going to be someone who solves problems with violence anymore. I used to be. I was trained to be, and I was good at it. And there are situations where that's the right thing, and I was the right person, and I don't regret any of it. He met Nolan's eyes. But that was a different life in a different place, and it served its purpose, and then it was done. And the life I'm in now, this life, this table, you, this life needs a different version of me, not a weaker one, a different one. He tapped the table once, lightly with one finger. Real strength knows when not to use itself. That's the hardest lesson. It's the one I'm still practicing. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the same rough effort as before, working each syllable like a muscle that hadn't been stretched in a long time. Still strong? The question was small and the voice was rough, and it cost him visibly, and it cracked something in Darius's chest that had been sealed for a very long time. Still strong, he said. He said it straight, level, without any of the emotion flooding his chest, making it into his voice, because Nolan needed the straight level answer more than he needed to know what the answer was costing. The strongest thing I did today was sit there. I need you to understand that. What looked like doing nothing was actually, it was the hardest work I've done in years. He held Nolan's gaze. And you helped. You looking at me helped. Knowing you were watching helped me be the person you needed to see. Nolan looked at his plate. His jaw moved slightly. Working. We helped each other, Darius said quietly. Something in Nolan's face shifted. That particular movement, the one that looked like the surface of a very still lake responding to something deep beneath it. He picked up his fork, put food in his mouth, chewed with his eyes toward the window, where the strip of sky had gone almost fully dark and the single star had been joined by a second one. They finished dinner. Afterward, they went to the workshop, as promised. The birdhouse walls held. The glue had set firmly, the joint that had been troubling Nolan for 3 days finally flush and solid. Darius held it up to the work light and ran his thumb along the seam. Perfect, he said, and meant it with the professional precision he brought to assessing woodwork, not the parental cushioning of small imperfections. Nolan took it back from him and held it himself, turning it in his hands. The roof next, Darius said. We'll cut the angle tomorrow if you want. 30 degrees, we said. Nolan looked at the roof piece on the bench. He picked it up and held it against the top of the walls, testing the fit. He turned it slightly, tried again. Something was not sitting right. The angle on one edge needed adjustment, and you could see him identify this in real time, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the repositioning, the renewed attempt. Yeah, Darius said, that edge. We'll take a little more off tomorrow. Good eye. Nolan set the pieces down carefully, the house and the roof side by side, separated, waiting for the next step. He looked at them for a moment the way he had looked at the sugar castle before they left ember and ground. The look of someone checking whether something is finished. Not yet, but coming. They did the rest of the evening the way they always did. Darius washing up while Nolan had his bath. Nolan appearing afterward in pajamas with his hair still slightly damp. The book from the shelf that they were 3/4 through. A story about a boy and a giant tortoise that Nolan had selected himself from the school library 4 weeks ago and that Darius had come to genuinely enjoy. He sat on the edge of Nolan's bed and read while Nolan lay with his hands behind his head, looking at the ceiling in that way he had during readings. Not zoned out, but the listening posture, the full attention posture that just happened to be directed upward rather than at the person speaking. He read 2 chapters. At the end of the second, he closed the book and set it on the nightstand. Good chapter, he said. From beside him, small and rough and clearly effortful and utterly deliberate. Yeah. Darius looked at the nightstand for a moment. The book. The glass of water. The small ceramic bluebird from Serena's craft fair. which had migrated from the workshop windowsill to Nolan's nightstand sometime in the last month without comment from either of them. It lived there now. That was where it lived. "Get some sleep," he said. He stood. He tucked the blanket. Nolan had very specific feelings about the tightness of the tuck, which was to say he preferred it loose on the left side and firm on the right, a preference so specific that Darius had spent 3 weeks figuring it out by observation before he got it consistently right. He got it right now. He turned off the lamp. The room went to the soft dark of a city apartment at night. Not full dark, never full dark in this neighborhood, always the ambient glow of the streetlight through the curtain. He was in the doorway when Nolan said it. "Daddy?" He turned. Nolan was lying in the dark with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling. His hands were at his sides now, outside the blanket. "Yeah," Darius said. A pause. The long pause of someone assembling something. "Miss her." The 2 words landed in the room with the full weight of everything that had been unsaid for 22 months. Simple. Exact. Devastating in the way that the simplest true things always are, because they don't allow for the buffer of complexity, they just go straight in and hit what they're aimed at. Darius stood in the doorway. "Me too," he said. His voice came out steady. Just barely. But steady. "Every day," Nolan said. "Every day," Darius said. The room was quiet for a moment. The streetlight made its soft geometry on the curtain. The ceramic bluebird sat on the nightstand in the near dark. "She knew," Darius said, "how much we loved her. She knew all the time. She was really sure about that." Nolan was quiet. "And she'd be—" He stopped. Tried again. "She would be so proud of you today, not because of anything special, just because of who you are." He put his hand on the doorframe. She already was, from the beginning. From the dark, nothing. But the quality of the nothing was different. The breathing was even. The body in the bed was still but not tense. "Get some sleep," Darius said again. Gently. He stepped back. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Tomorrow?" A breath. Working. "Birdhouse?" He felt it move through him. That word, tomorrow. The smallest possible act of forward motion. A child planning one day into the future. A child for whom tomorrow existed and contained a project and was worth mentioning. 22 months of grief and silence, and he was here in this doorway hearing his son say tomorrow. Like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Tomorrow," Darius said. "Birdhouse. We'll get the roof angle right." A sound from the bed. Small. Affirmative. Darius pulled the door most of the way closed, leaving the usual gap. Wide enough for light and sound to travel. Narrow enough to feel private. He stood in the hallway for a moment with his back to the door, and his eyes closed and both hands flat against the wall, and he breathed. In through the nose, long, out through the mouth, slow. He stood there until he was sure. Then he walked to the living room and sat on the couch in the lamplight with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the birdhouse on the coffee table. The small, unfinished structure in pale pine, walls glued and solid, roof piece waiting, the tiny circular opening for the bird not yet cut. A thing in process, becoming what it was going to be. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached across the coffee table and very carefully picked up the birdhouse in both hands, turning it to look at the joint that had troubled Nolan. The front wall seam that was now, as Darius had said, perfect. He ran his thumb along it, smooth, true, the work of patient hands that had decided the world was worth building something for again. He set it back down. Outside, the city made its ordinary night sounds. A bus on the cross street, a door somewhere, the wind working through the last of the season's leaves. The lamp made its warm circle on the walls of the apartment that had become home again, slowly, against everything, by the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary moments stacked in a crosshatch pattern that distributed the weight of grief more evenly until the structure could hold. Darius Kane sat on the couch in the lamplight, and for the first time in 22 months he was not managing the present moment. He was simply in it, not in the past, with its loss, and not in the terrible middle months, with their blankness, and not in the cautious, careful day-by-day of recent times. Here, this apartment, this night, this life which had been broken and had been rebuilt differently, and he understood now with the certainty that came not from optimism, but from evidence, standing. Tomorrow there would be the school run and the workshop, and 6 days of work, and Tuesday coming around again, and whatever that brought. The world did not stop being difficult because one afternoon had been extraordinary. He knew this. He was not a man given to the belief that anything resolved cleanly or permanently. But his son had said his name today, twice, and had said tomorrow. Darius leaned back on the couch and looked at the ceiling and stayed there in the quiet apartment with the lamp on and his son sleeping behind a nearly closed door. And he let that be enough, because it was enough, and more than enough, and enough was all any day had ever been asked to be. He fell asleep on the couch, not intentionally. He had meant to move to the bedroom eventually, had been planning to get up in another few minutes, had been telling himself that for approximately 45 minutes, while the lamp stayed on, and the city made its night sounds outside, and the birdhouse sat on the coffee table in the warm light. But the accumulated weight of the day had its own opinion about timelines, and at some point between one breath and the next, Darius Kane simply went under. He slept without dreaming, which was itself a kind of gift. There had been a period, in the months immediately after the accident, when sleep had been its own hostile territory, full of images and sounds and the particular cruelty of dreams that gave Serena back to him in vivid detail, only to take her again at waking. That had eased over time, the way most things eased over time, not disappearing but changing texture, going from sharp to dull, from ambush to ache. Now most nights were simply dark. Rest without theater. He woke at 5:42 to the sound of movement in the apartment. Not alarming movement. Familiar movement. The particular sound of small feet on hardwood and the deliberate, slightly exaggerated tiptoe of a child who is trying very hard not to wake someone and is therefore making approximately the same amount of noise as usual. Darius lay still on the couch for a moment, listening. The sounds moved from the hallway to the kitchen, the refrigerator opening, the refrigerator closing, the soft thump of something being set on the counter. Then the footsteps came back across the apartment and stopped near the coffee table. Darius opened his eyes. Nolan was standing 3 feet away in his pajamas, holding a glass of orange juice in both hands with the focused care of someone transporting something fragile, his hair flattened on one side from the pillow. He looked at his father on the couch with the specific expression of a child who has been caught in the middle of a kind gesture and is not sure whether to complete it or abort. Darius looked at the orange juice. "That for me?" he said. His voice came out rough with sleep. Nolan looked at the glass, then at his father. Then he crossed the remaining distance to the couch and held it out. Darius sat up and took it. It was cold, just from the refrigerator, not yet approaching room temperature, the glass slightly damp on the outside. He took a long drink. Nolan stood beside the couch, watching him with the expression of someone monitoring a project. "Thank you," Darius said. Nolan sat down on the couch beside him. Not at the other end, beside him close, the way he'd leaned against him in the elevator last night. Just the simple physics of a child locating the nearest warmth and occupying it without ceremony. Darius put his arm around him. Outside the window, the sky was the particular gray-blue of very early morning, not yet light, not fully dark, the city in the brief suspended moment before it committed to the day. A pigeon moved on the fire escape with the clumsy authority of something that owned where it was. The streetlight was still on, its orange circle on the sidewalk below slightly faded now against the gathering dawn. They sat like that for a while. Neither of them spoke. It was not the silence of the last 22 months, not the heavy, sealed, grief-dense silence that Darius had learned to navigate the way you navigate a room in the dark, carefully and by memory. It was something different, a morning silence. The ordinary quiet of two people who are comfortable enough in each other's company that they don't need to fill the space between them. Nolan broke it first. "Birdhouse," he said. Darius looked down at him. "It's 5:45 in the morning." Nolan looked at the coffee table where the birdhouse sat. "After breakfast," Darius said, "and after I've been awake for more than 3 minutes." Something that was almost a smile. The edge of one. The muscles doing that slow, careful thing they'd done in the cafe the day before, finding their way back. Darius finished the orange juice. He set the glass on the coffee table and leaned back and looked at the ceiling and thought about what a Wednesday could hold. School run at 8. A client consultation at 10. a couple in the Fairview district who wanted a custom dining table and had sent him 3 contradictory sets of reference images that he would need to reconcile into something coherent. Pickup at 3:15. Whatever the afternoon brought. Next Tuesday, ember and ground. The thought landed with a warmth he hadn't expected, not the careful, effortful warmth of something he was maintaining by will, but the easy warmth of something that was simply true. He wanted to go back, not to prove anything, not to revisit the drama of the day before, but because it was their place, and it was Tuesday, and the sugar packets would be in their ceramic dish on the table, and Priya would have a cookie ready without being asked. He wondered if Ivy and her mother would come in on a Saturday. He thought they might. They made breakfast together, which was not something they had done before in any organized way. Darius cooked, Nolan ate. That was the established arrangement. But this morning Nolan followed him into the kitchen and stood beside the counter with the evident intention of participating, and Darius adjusted without comment, giving him the job of cracking the eggs into the bowl because Nolan had watched him do it dozens of times and clearly felt he understood the theory. The first egg was slightly too forceful, shell fragments. "Fish those out," Darius said, handing him a spoon. "Not here. Let me do it. Not careful. Just the next instruction." Nolan fished out the shell fragments with the focus of a surgical procedure, 3 of them. He held each one up briefly to confirm its removal before setting it on the counter. "Good," Darius said. "Try the second one lighter." The second egg was better. Clean break, no shells. Nolan looked at it with visible satisfaction. "Natural," Darius said. They ate scrambled eggs and toast at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window now. Full gray and gold, the sky having made its decision about the day, which appeared to be partly cloudy with the particular brightness that October mornings had when the sun came through intermittently and made everything look slightly more saturated than it actually was. The strip of sky above the alley showed one slow-moving cloud, and below it, a telephone wire where 2 pigeons sat with their shoulders hunched against the cold, in the companionable way of birds that have decided the wire is adequate for now. Nolan watched the pigeons and ate his eggs. "They're the same ones that were on the fire escape this morning," Darius said. "Or they're different ones who look exactly the same. I've never been able to tell." Nolan looked at the pigeons, then at his father. He made a small sound that conveyed approximately, "Same ones, probably." "You might be right," Darius said. He drove Nolan to school at 7:50. The school was 4 blocks away, and they usually walked, but it was colder this morning, and Darius had the truck, so they drove, down Sycamore, left on 11th, 3 blocks to the school on the corner of 11th and Marsh. The drop-off line moved with its usual efficiency. Nolan's teacher, Ms. Rafferty, was at the door as always, a compact woman in her early 50s with gray-streaked hair, and the particular patience of someone who had been teaching young children for long enough that almost nothing surprised her anymore. She had been told, in a conference with Darius and Dr. Mills 2 months ago, that Nolan was making progress at his own pace, and that the school's job was to continue doing what they had been doing, providing consistent, low-pressure presence, not pushing for verbal participation, treating Nolan's nonverbal communication as complete rather than insufficient. She had received this guidance with the simple directness of someone who had already been doing it instinctively and was pleased to have the confirmation. Nolan got out of the truck. He was 3 steps toward the school door when he stopped. He turned around. Darius, still at the wheel with the window down, watched his son turn and look at him across the drop-off lane. Nolan raised one hand. Not quite a wave. The same gesture Ivy had used at the cafe door, something between a wave and a salute. A gesture that meant, "I see you, you see me, we're okay." Darius raised his hand back. Ms. Rafferty, standing at the door, witnessed this exchange with the expression of a woman who had been watching for it for 8 months and was not going to make it into a production. She simply held the door and let Nolan come through, and if her expression, as she glanced briefly at the truck, was one of quiet, private relief, it was gone before anyone could have named it. Darius drove to the client consultation. The couple in Fairview, Marcus and Diane Holloway, mid-50s, recently renovated kitchen, opinions, spent 40 minutes with him around their existing dining table, showing him photographs on a tablet and describing in elaborate and occasionally contradictory detail what they wanted. Darius listened. He asked precise questions about the room's dimensions, the light source, whether they wanted the table to seat 6 always or 8 occasionally, whether the wood should match the existing cabinetry or contrast it. He took notes in the small notebook he always carried. By the end of the meeting, he had a clear picture of what they wanted, which was different in several respects from what they had described, but which he could see in the room and in the way they moved around it and gestured at it. He told them he'd have drawings by Friday. Marcus shook his hand with the two-handed grip of a man who had decided he trusted someone. Diane walked him to the door and said, "My daughter recommended you, Mr. Kane. She said you built something for her that made her cry." "She told me that too," Darius said. "I took it as a compliment." Diane looked at him for a moment with the assessing directness of a woman who had been evaluating people for decades. "It was," she said. He drove back through the neighborhood, taking the long way without exactly deciding to, down Birch Street, past Ember and Ground. It was mid-morning and the cafe was in its quiet middle period, post-breakfast and pre-lunch, the kind of hour when the tables were mostly occupied by people with laptops and no particular urgency. Through the window, he could see the corner table, their table. Empty at this hour, as it always was when they weren't in it, just a table with mismatched chairs and the ceramic dish of sugar packets waiting in the center. He drove past without stopping. Tuesday, he thought. Tuesday was for that. He spent the afternoon in the workshop, drafting the Holloway table on paper the way he always started. By hand, not computer, because he thought better with a pencil, and because the drawings he made by hand had a quality to them that translated differently into wood than drawings made on a screen. He was 3/4 through the second draft, working on the joinery details at the table's corners, when he heard the front door. He looked at the clock. 3:40. Nolan was home. The school was 4 blocks away. They had established, 2 months ago, a trial arrangement. Nolan was old enough and the neighborhood safe enough, and the route direct enough that he could walk home on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, with the protocol that he came directly home and knocked on the workshop door when he arrived, so Darius could log the time and confirm his arrival. It was another thing that had happened gradually, another assertion of Nolan's slow, quiet expansion into the world on his own terms. The knock came on the workshop door. 3 knocks, their specific pattern. "Good timing," Darius called. "Come in if you want." The door opened. Nolan came in with his backpack still on, his jacket unzipped, the cold of the outside still coming off him. He looked at the drafting table. He came to stand beside his father and looked at the drawings. "Dining table," Darius said, "for a couple in Fairview. They wanted to seat 8, but they only ever have 6 for dinner. So I'm building it for 6 with leaves that add the other 2 when they need them." Nolan looked at the drawings. His finger came up and traced the line of one corner joint without touching the paper. "Yeah," Darius said. "That's the tricky part. You want the leaf joint to be invisible when the leaf is in, but it still has to carry the load." He picked up the pencil and drew a quick cross-section. "I'm thinking a butterfly key here. Keeps it tight." Nolan looked at the cross-section. He pointed at the butterfly key shape. "You like that?" Darius said. Nolan made the affirmative sound. "Me too," Darius said. "It's the right call." Nolan took his backpack off and set it by the door. He went to his stool in the corner, the one he'd been using since he first started coming into the workshop, and sat on it and took the birdhouse from the shelf where Darius had moved it that morning to keep it at a stable temperature while the overnight glue fully cured. He held it, turned it, examined the joint that had finally satisfied him. "Ready for the roof," Darius said, without looking up from the drawings. "Whenever you want to do it." A pause. "Now," Nolan said. Darius looked at him. Nolan was looking at the birdhouse, his expression entirely matter-of-fact, as if he had simply answered a logistical question, which he had. Now. One word, chosen and deployed with the clean efficiency of someone who has decided that if a word will do the work, use it. Darius set down his pencil. He pulled the roof piece from the shelf. He set up the miter saw and explained the angle again, 30 degrees, which would give the roof its pitch, the specific slope that would shed rain and look right. And then, with Nolan standing beside him in the safety position they'd established from the beginning, he made the cut. The blade went through the wood cleanly. One pass. The angle was exact. He handed the roof piece to Nolan. Nolan held it up to the walls, fitted it, adjusted, fitted again. This time it sat right, clean and even, the pitch, matching on both sides, the overhang equal. He pressed it down gently, feeling the fit. Perfect, Darius said. Nolan looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his father and said, 3 words, rough and careful and entirely unambiguous. We did it. Darius stood very still for a beat. We did, he said. Nolan set the roof piece carefully to the side. Not glued yet, that would be tomorrow, letting him sit with the completed vision overnight. And he held the birdhouse in both hands, looking at it with the expression of someone seeing the finished thing for the first time, the way it was going to be, the thing that had been in his hands as individual pieces, and was now, in his imagination, whole. He looked at his father. Where? He said. Darius understood the question immediately. The fire escape, outside your window. That cardinal keeps coming around. We might as well give him somewhere to be. Nolan looked at the birdhouse. Something moved across his face, slow and real, the smile coming in its full form now, less careful than the one in the cafe, less restrained, the smile of a child who is in a safe place with a person he trusts and does not need to meter his own happiness. It stayed. Darius looked at his son's face and thought, there you are. The same thought he'd had in the cafe yesterday, but fuller now, more certain. Not there you are, finally. Not with impatience or relief at a problem resolved. Just, there you are. The recognition of someone you love returning from somewhere far away and arriving, fully, in front of you. They made dinner together again. More deliberately this time. Nolan had positions and preferences, it turned out, now that he was applying words to things. He wanted to stir the rice. He reported with the 2-word economy that was becoming his style, when it was too hot, and when the chicken smelled like hers, which was the most complex sentence he had yet produced, and which detonated quietly inside Darius's chest in the way that the simplest true things always did. Yeah, Darius said at the stove, like hers, getting closer. They ate. The pigeons were gone from the telephone wire. The sky was fully dark and clear, the kind of clear that happened in October when the air had enough cold in it to compress the atmosphere, and the stars were visible even through the city light. Not many, but some, the brightest ones holding their position above the alley. After dinner, Nolan helped clear the table. This was new. Not the helping, which he had done in small ways before, but the initiation of it, picking up his plate without being asked, carrying it to the sink, coming back for the glasses. Darius watched this from the corner of his eye and said nothing because nothing was necessary. At the sink, washing up, he heard Nolan behind him. Daddy. He turned. Nolan was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hands at his sides and his expression carrying the look of interior assembly. The look of someone putting words in order before releasing them, taking the time the words needed. Darius dried his hands on the dish towel. Nolan took a breath. Small. Preparing. Is it okay, he said, each word coming with the careful effort of something handled with both hands, to be happy? The question was so exact that it took a moment to fully arrive. Darius stood with the dish towel in his hands and felt it come in. The precision of it, the thing it was actually asking, which was not a simple question about emotional permission, but something much larger and older and more specific to this family, in this apartment, in this year of their lives. Whether the return of happiness was a betrayal of grief, whether being okay was a way of forgetting, whether the door moving meant abandoning what was on the other side. He had asked himself this question in various forms for 22 months. He had not had a clean answer. He looked at his son. Yeah, he said. It's okay. He set the dish towel down. It doesn't mean we miss her less. Happy and missing her, they can both be true. They're both true for me, all the time. He paused. She would want you happy. That's not a thing I'm making up to make you feel better. That's just true. She would want it more than almost anything. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around his father's waist. A full hug, not the careful lean or the loose proximity of recent months, but a hug, the real kind, arms and weight, and the press of a child against a parent that means something that words were invented after. Darius put his arms around him. He held his son in the kitchen while the remaining water ran down the drain in the sink and the city went on outside the window doing its city things, and he held him with everything he had, the full strength of a man who had spent 2 years learning to hold the right things in the right ways. And he said nothing because there was nothing left to say that the holding didn't say better. When Nolan finally stepped back, his eyes were slightly bright. He wiped his face with the back of his hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who had cried and was done and was ready to move forward, and he looked at his father, and what was in his expression, clear and direct and entirely his own, was something Darius had not seen there in 22 months. Presence. Full, unclouded, forward-facing presence. The look of a child who is in his life rather than observing it from behind glass. The look of someone who has decided, at whatever depth 6-year-olds make decisions that last, that the world is worth being in. "Okay," Nolan said. "Okay," Darius said. They did the evening, bath, book, the 2 chapters of the tortoise story, which was almost finished now, 3 chapters from the end. Darius read and Nolan listened from the ceiling-looking posture, and twice during the reading he made sounds that indicated engagement with the plot. A small, sharp intake at a tense moment, the affirmative hum at a resolution. Participation. The ongoing, low-key, entirely genuine participation of a reader who is inside the story. At the end of the 2nd chapter, Darius closed the book. "2 more chapters?" he said. "Maybe 3. Nolan looked at him. "Tomorrow both?" "2 tomorrow," Darius said. "We'll finish it by the weekend." Satisfied. The mathematics of narrative established. Nolan settled back into his pillow. Darius tucked the blanket, loose left, firm right, and stood, and was almost at the door when Nolan said, in a voice that was slightly clearer tonight, slightly less rough, the mechanism finding its old ease by degrees, "Tell me something." Darius turned. It was what Serena had always said. At bedtime, years before the accident, in the apartment before this one and the one before that, it had been their ritual. She would finish reading to Nolan, and then she would say, "Tell me something," and Darius would tell him something. A fact, a memory, an observation about the day. Something small and real to carry into sleep. Darius had forgotten about it, or had set it down somewhere and not picked it back up, in the months of grief and reconstruction. He had not done it since she was gone. He stood in the doorway and looked at his son in the near dark. "Okay," he said. He thought for a moment, not manufacturing, looking for the real thing, the thing that was true today and worth carrying. "There's a bird out there," he said, "that's going to have a house next week, and the person who built it has his mother's hands and his father's stubbornness, and he figured out that crosshatch is stronger than vertical stacking, and he rebuilt something after it got knocked down and built it better than the first time." He paused. "I think that bird's going to be pretty lucky." From the bed, in the soft dark, a sound. Small and real and warm. The sound of someone receiving something they needed and not needing to say so in order for it to be true. Darius said, "Good night, Nolan." "Good night," said his son. 2 words. Clear, easy, as if they had always been there, waiting for the room to be ready to hold them. He pulled the door to its usual gap and stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he walked to the living room and turned off the lamp and stood in the dark apartment for just a moment before his eyes adjusted and the city's light came through the curtains and made everything visible. The birdhouse was on the coffee table. The roof piece was beside it, separate, waiting. Tomorrow he would help his son glue the roof on. Tomorrow he would draw the 3rd draft of the Holloway table. He would pick Nolan up from school, and they would walk back through the neighborhood and stop at Mr. Osai's if the lights were on. And in the evening they would read 2 more chapters of the tortoise story, and Nolan would ask him to tell him something, and he would find the true thing and say it. Next Tuesday they would go to Ember and Ground. Priya would have the cookie ready. Nolan would build. And maybe, in the weeks that followed, he would call Boone and take his son to meet the Colonel's grandchildren. Maybe he would reach out to Tom Vasquez in Cincinnati. Maybe he would call his mother and tell her that soon was actually true. Maybe there would be a Saturday when Claire and Ivy walked through the neighborhood and turned into the cafe on a whim, and a small girl with a flower-embroidered jacket would drop into the chair across from his son like she'd always had a seat there, and the castle would go up with 2 pairs of hands again, different and collaborative and better for it. The door was open, not all the way. Grief does not open all the way. It changes shape, changes weight, changes from the thing that occupies the whole room to the thing that occupies a corner of it, and the corner is always there, but the room has other things in it now. Building and cooking and birdhouses and orange juice carried with careful hands at 5:42 in the morning, and a voice finding its way back one word at a time, and two people in a kitchen holding on. Darius Kane walked to the window and looked out at the October street below. The streetlight was on. A couple walked past below, their voices carrying up briefly and then fading. A taxi turned the far corner. The leaves in the gutter moved in a brief wind and then settled. An ordinary Wednesday night. He stood at the window and looked at it. The ordinary street, the ordinary city, the ordinary particular beauty of a world that continued, that had always continued, regardless of what you asked of it, or what it had taken from you. He had not found this beautiful for a long time. He did not have a clean explanation for why he found it beautiful tonight, only that his son had said goodnight, only that the word had come out clear and easy, as if it had been waiting behind the door this whole time, as if all it had needed was enough consecutive days of steadiness stacked beneath it, crosshatch style, distributing the weight of loss until the structure could hold, until the moment came when a small boy in navy pajamas in a warm apartment could open his mouth and let something out that had been held for 2 years, and the world received it, and nothing broke. He stayed at the window a while longer. Then he turned and walked to the bedroom, and he lay down in the dark, and he closed his eyes. And for the first time in 22 months, he did not spend the space before sleep managing anything. He just let himself rest. 2 rooms away, Nolan was sleeping. The ceramic bluebird was on his nightstand. The birdhouse was on the coffee table with the roof piece beside it, waiting to be whole. Outside, the October wind moved through the street, and the city breathed around them, and the streetlight held its circle on the sidewalk, steady and orange and unchanging. They were going to be all right, not because the hard things were behind them, some of them weren't, and Darius was too clear-eyed a man to pretend otherwise, but because they were in it together, and the ground was firm, and the structure held, and tomorrow was a real day that a boy was already planning for, and that was enough. That was everything.